Tonight, I find myself remembering the newsrooms of 1950s America, the way cigarette smoke drifted through editorial offices thick with the scent of ink and ambition, and how the quiet rustle of teletype machines shaped the rhythm of a nation's understanding. Back then, journalists carried notebooks with carbon paper between the pages, leaving ghostly impressions of every story they wrote, though some stories, as we would later learn, cast shadows far deeper than carbon could capture. This is history as it was lived and hurried, unpolished, real, the story of how the line between journalism and espionage became as blurred as morning fog rolling across the Potomac, and how men in Georgetown drawing rooms convinced themselves they were saving democracy by quietly corrupting its most essential pillar, a free press. I remember the weight of those years when every headline carried the possibility of nuclear annihilation, when the very air seemed charged with invisible threats from beyond the Iron Curtain. It was an age that made extraordinary measures seem not just reasonable, but patriotic. An age when the Central Intelligence Agency, barely older than the decade itself, began weaving relationships with journalists that would span continents and compromise consciences. If this quiet approach to the past helps you unwind, a like would mean a lot. Subscribe if you'd like to join me for more slow journeys through history. Tell me in the comments where tonight finds you listening. What draws you to these forgotten corners of Cold War America, where the most powerful weapon wasn't a bomb, but a carefully planted story in tomorrow's morning paper? The truth about Operation Mockingbird, if that was even its real name, is more complex than the conspiracy theories suggest, yet more troubling than the official denials admit. It's a story written in the margins of history, in the spaces between what was documented and what was whispered, between what was necessary and what was unforgivable. Dim the lights. Let's drift back to those smoky newsrooms where truth and deception learned to dance together in the shadows of the atomic age. I remember the peculiar silence that fell over America in those first years after the war ended. Not the silence of peace, but the heavy quiet of a nation holding its breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop from somewhere beyond the Iron Curtain. The air itself seemed different, than charged with invisible tension, thick with the knowledge that somewhere across the world other hands held the power to end everything we knew. The weight of nuclear dread settled over American suburbs like morning frost, touching everything with its cold presence. Children practiced ducking under desks, while their teachers tried to explain how thin aluminum and wood might protect them from the unimaginable. Mothers hung laundry on lines stretched between Victory Gardens, turned ordinary again, but their eyes would drift toward the sky more often than they once had, searching for contrails that might carry something other than mail and passengers. Back then, the fear was not abstract. It lived in the basement fallout shelters that sprouting across middle-class neighborhoods like mushrooms after rain. It whispered through the static of radio broadcasts that sometimes carried voices speaking in languages most Americans couldn't understand, but whose tone needed no translation. The world had become a smaller place overnight, shrunk by the terrible mathematics of intercontinental destruction, and Americans were learning what it meant to be vulnerable for the first time since 1812. I remember how the newspapers felt different too. The headlines carried a new kind of urgency, not the clean purpose of wartime reporting, but something more complex, more uncertain. Columnists and editorial writers struggled to explain a conflict that had no clear battle lines, no uniformed enemies marching across clearly marked borders. This was something new under the sooner war, fought with ideas and influence, where the most important victories might be won in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. The coffee shop conversations I remember from those days had a different quality than what came before or after. Men who had fought through Normandy and Guadalcanal found themselves discussing ideological abstractions with the same intensity they had once reserved for ammunition shortages and supply lines. The enemy this time wore no uniform, claimed no territory that could be colored red on classroom maps, and advanced through channels as invisible as radio waves carrying propaganda across international borders. In Washington, the marble corridors of government buildings echoed with footsteps that moved with new purpose. The wartime apparatus that had coordinated the defeat of fascism was being retooled for a different kind of struggle, one that would require subtlety where the previous war had demanded force, patience where it had required speed, and deception where it had celebrated heroism. The men walking those halls had learned their craft in the shadows of occupied Europe, and now they were being asked to apply those same skills to peacetime America. The House Un-American Activities Committee had been meeting since 1938, but after the war it took on the quality of a fever dream, calling witnesses who arrived clutching briefcases full of names and accusations. I remember the way those hearings felt on television, the harsh lighting that made everyone look guilty of something, the way congressmen leaned into microphones that amplified every pause and stammer, every nervous clearing of throat into evidence of hidden loyalties. The committee rooms where these interrogations took place smelled of old wood, polish, and fresh fear. Witnesses sat at tables that had been designed for comfort, but had somehow become instruments of exposure, their mahogany surfaces reflecting the television lights that transformed private beliefs into public spectacle. The acoustics of those rooms had a particular quality designed to carry the normal business of democratic deliberation, but now amplifying whispered accusations and half-heard confessions into the living rooms of America. Senator Joseph McCarthy, that intense man from Wisconsin, had discovered something powerful in those post-war years. He understood that fear could be shaped like clay in skilled hands, molded into political capital and public attention. I remember watching him work a crowd, the way his voice could shift from conversational warmth to theatrical outrage in the space of a single sentence. How he could make the abstract threat of communist infiltration feel as immediate as a storm approaching across open prairie. The lists he waved during his speeches were never quite what they seemed. Sometimes 205 names, sometimes 57, sometimes just a vague reference to known communists in the State Department. But the specific numbers mattered less than the theatrical gesture, the way the papers fluttered in his hands like evidence of hidden betrayal, like proof that the enemy had already crossed the borders and taken positions among the unsuspecting. McCarthyism was never really about Joseph McCarthy himself. It was about the temperature of American anxiety in those years, the way that perfectly reasonable people could convince themselves that extraordinary measures were not only justified but urgently necessary. The philosophy department at the local college, the editorial board of the regional newspaper, the leadership of the labor union at the manufacturing plant, all of these suddenly seemed like potential entry points for an ideology that promised to remake America according to foreign blueprints. The atomic bomb had changed more than military strategy. It had altered the fundamental rhythm of American life, introducing the possibility that everything familiar could be erased in less time than it took to brew morning coffee. This knowledge settled into the national consciousness like sediment in a stream, coloring every other concern with its dark possibility. The communist threat felt real because annihilation had become real, and if the unthinkable was possible in physics, it seemed reasonable to assume it was possible in politics as well. I remember how the magazines of the time tried to explain this new world to their readers. Life and Look and the Saturday Evening Post ran articles about civil defense and fallout shelters, alongside features about new kitchen appliances and summer vacation destinations. The juxtaposition felt normal then, this mixing of domestic comfort with existential dread, as if Americans were learning to live with contradiction the way previous generations had learned to live with seasonal changes. The advertising of the era reflected this strange duality as well. Automobile companies promised cars that would last for decades, while defense contractors ran recruitment advertisements seeking engineers who could design systems to end the world in minutes. Insurance companies offered policies that covered everything except the one risk that kept people awake at night. And cookbook authors published guides to gourmet meals that could be prepared in basement shelters stocked with canned goods and bottled water. The churches filled with a different kind of congregation in those years. Not just the traditionally faithful, but Americans seeking reassurance about cosmic questions that politics and science couldn't answer. Sermons took on themes that would have seemed foreign to previous generations: the moral implications of mutual assured destruction, the Christian response to ideological warfare, the role of divine providence in an age when human beings had claimed the power to destroy creation itself. Universities, too, became battlegrounds of the mind. Professors who had once concerned themselves only with esoteric debates about Plato or the structure of Elizabethan drama suddenly found themselves scrutinized for their political loyalties. Students whispered about which faculty members were too sympathetic to progressive causes, and trustees quietly took calls from congressional staffers who wanted to know whether the curriculum was sufficiently American in its orientation. It was in this climate that the intelligence agencies began to understand the value of narrative. A story could move faster than a tank division, reach places where troops could not, and shape perceptions in ways that bombs never could. And so, what began as occasional attempts to guide foreign correspondence or offer background briefings gradually developed into something far more organized: the deliberate cultivation of journalists as partners in the waging of psychological warfare. At first, it seemed almost innocent. Reporters were offered access to embassy receptions, briefings over drinks, occasional tips that helped them beat their competitors into print by a few crucial hours. But the favors came with subtle expectations that certain phrases would find their way into copy, that particular framings would be used to describe events, that inconvenient details might be left out entirely. Journalism was not yet an arm of intelligence, but the two professions were learning to share a dance floor. The language of national security proved to be a potent justification. Editors told themselves they were merely exercising patriotism, that publishing certain kinds of stories might aid the enemy, while soft-pedaling others might protect American lives. These were not absurd rationalizations in a world where nuclear war felt one bad decision away. The idea that a headline could trigger catastrophe seemed plausible enough to sober even the most hard-bitten newsman. But in retrospect, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that the press surrendered more than it gained. By allowing government officials to set the boundaries of coverage, journalists began to internalize those boundaries as natural. Certain topics were deemed unfit for the public, not because they lacked importance, but because they conflicted with the imperatives of security. The watchdog had not yet been fully domesticated, but its bark was already softening. The irony was that even as journalists were persuaded to temper their independence at home, their colleagues abroad were being encouraged to take on far more active roles. Correspondents in Latin America or the Middle East sometimes doubled as couriers, passing along messages or packages under diplomatic cover. Others quietly gathered information on local political movements, providing the kind of granular detail that no field officer could easily obtain without arousing suspicion. These arrangements were not always formal, nor were they always voluntary. Some reporters resisted the encroachments of intelligence, insisting that their duty was to readers, not governments, but others were drawn in by the allure of access, the thrill of being close to the levers of power, or simply the belief that in an existential struggle, neutrality was a luxury the press could not afford. By the mid-1950s, this quiet courtship between journalism and espionage had solidified into something more organized. The Central Intelligence Agency began maintaining files on hundreds of American reporters, cataloging not just their areas of expertise, but their personalities, vulnerabilities, and potential usefulness. Some were listed as assets, others as contacts, and still others as merely approachable. The categories themselves revealed a mindset in which information was simply another battlefield resource. What made the program distinctive was not simply that it existed, but that it was so rarely challenged. Few editors publicly questioned whether such relationships were appropriate. Few reporters risked careers to call attention to them. The press, which prided itself on asking uncomfortable questions, often chose silence when the subject turned uncomfortably inward. It was as if the mirror had been covered, lest anyone be forced to acknowledge what stared back. The legacy of these years would linger long after the ink dried. Habits of deference hardened into traditions, and boundaries once crossed became invisible. The notion that journalists might serve both the public and the state, however uneasily, seeped into the DNA of the profession. By the time the first whispers of Operation Mockingbird began to surface, the press was already entangled in ways that would prove difficult to unwind. The birth of the Central Intelligence Agency was not the clean, bureaucratic affair that official histories might suggest. I remember the way those early CIA offices felt, like rooms where the ghosts of the Office of Strategic Services still lingered in the corners, whispering their wartime secrets to a new generation of cold warriors. The musty smell of OSS files being transferred to new CIA offices carried with it the accumulated weight of 4 years of clandestine operations. Each manila folder a testament to methods that had proven effective in wartime and might prove necessary again in this strange new peace. Harry Truman signed the National Security Act on July 26, 1947, in the quiet of a summer afternoon that felt heavy with humidity and possibility. The pen scratched across the paper with the same sound that had authorized the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. But this signature carried different implications. With a few strokes of ink on presidential stationery, America was acknowledging that it needed a peacetime intelligence service, a permanent apparatus for gathering secrets and conducting operations that couldn't be discussed in congressional hearings or newspaper editorials. The men who walked into the new CIA headquarters brought with them the institutional memory of the OSS, that wartime organization that had been America's first systematic attempt at professional intelligence work. They carried briefcases filled with contact lists and operational files. But more importantly, they brought a culture that had been shaped by 4 years of working behind enemy lines, coordinating with resistance movements and learning that the most effective operations were often the ones that left no obvious fingerprints. I remember hearing about those early days from men who lived through the transition. The way they described the peculiar atmosphere of an organization that was simultaneously starting fresh and continuing work that had never really stopped. The OSS had been officially dissolved in October 1945, but its personnel had scattered to other government agencies rather than returning to civilian life, carrying their expertise and their networks of contacts like seeds that would eventually sprout in new organizational soil. The unvouchered funds that transferred from OSS to CIA represented more than just accounting procedures. These were budget lines that didn't appear in public documents, money that could be spent without the normal oversight mechanisms that governed other government agencies. The men who administered these funds understood that they were being entrusted with resources that would allow them to operate in the gray zones where traditional diplomacy ended and something more flexible began. The physical spaces where this work was conducted had their own particular atmosphere. Office buildings that looked conventional from the outside, but contained rooms where maps of Eastern Europe were marked with symbols that meant nothing to casual observers, where filing cabinets held documents that would never be released to presidential libraries, where telephone conversations were conducted in languages and codes that transformed mundane discussions about travel and meetings into something far more complex. The recruitment of personnel for the new agency drew heavily from universities that had contributed to wartime intelligence work. Yale and Harvard, Princeton and Columbia had all provided men who understood that intellectual analysis could be as important as physical courage in intelligence operations. These recruits brought with them not just academic credentials, but social connections that extended through the worlds of journalism, finance, and international business networks that would prove invaluable in operations that required civilian cover and professional credibility. The early operations in Greece and Italy served as testing grounds for techniques that would later be applied on a much larger scale. In Greece, CIA officers worked with local contacts to support government forces against communist guerrillas, learning how to coordinate military assistance with propaganda operations, how to shape news coverage of complex political situations, how to present American involvement as humanitarian aid rather than ideological interference. The Italian operations were even more instructive. Working through labor unions, student organizations, and media outlets, CIA officers discovered that the most effective influence operations were often invisible to their targets, rather than obvious propaganda that announced its foreign origins. The most successful efforts looked like authentic expressions of local opinion, domestic political movements that happened to align with American interests and objectives. These European operations taught important lessons about the relationship between intelligence work and journalism. Foreign correspondents for American newspapers and magazines were ideally positioned to gather information, make contacts, and observe political developments that might have intelligence value. At the same time, the stories they wrote for American audiences helped shape public opinion about international events in ways that could support or undermine government policy objectives. The men running these early operations began to understand that journalism and intelligence work shared certain fundamental characteristics. Both involved cultivating sources. Both required the ability to separate reliable information from deliberate deception. Both operated in environments where access to key figures could determine success or failure. The skills required for effective journalism, curiosity, persistence, the ability to gain trust, were remarkably similar to those needed for intelligence collection. Frank Wisner, who would later become central to the agency's media operations, was already demonstrating the kind of creative thinking that would characterize CIA approach to influence operations. His work in Romania during the war had shown him how political outcomes could be shaped through careful coordination of multiple pressure points, economic incentives, media coverage, strategic leaks to journalists, private conversations with key influencers, all working together to create an environment where desired decisions seemed like natural, inevitable choices. The agency's legal authorities, as defined in the National Security Act, were deliberately vague about the boundaries of permissible activity. The mandate to perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council may, from time to time, direct was language that could accommodate almost any operation that could be justified as serving national security interests. This flexibility was intentional, designed to allow rapid response to emerging threats without requiring congressional approval for each new type of activity. The budgetary arrangements that supported CIA operations were equally flexible. Funds could be transferred from other government agencies without detailed accounting, creating pools of money that could be used for purposes that would never appear in public budget documents. These financial mechanisms made possible a level of operational independence that was unprecedented in American government. But they also created an environment where activities could expand far beyond their original scope without normal oversight mechanisms coming into play. The personnel who staffed the early CIA were drawn from backgrounds that predisposed them to understand influence operations. Many had worked in wartime propaganda. Others had experience in international business or journalism. Still, others had academic backgrounds in psychology or political science. What they shared was an appreciation for the complexity of human motivation and the ways that information could be shaped to encourage particular responses without obvious coercion or manipulation. The physical infrastructure supporting these operations was more sophisticated than most observers realized. Communications equipment that allowed secure contact with agents around the world, document production facilities that could create authentic-looking papers for any country or organization, financial networks that could move money across international borders without leaving obvious trails. This technical capability created the possibility for operations that were far more complex and far-reaching than anything that had been attempted during wartime. The relationship between the CIA and other government agencies was being defined through practice rather than formal agreements. State Department officials found themselves working with CIA officers whose activities might affect diplomatic initiatives in ways that weren't always coordinated in advance. Military commanders discovered that intelligence operations in their areas of responsibility might proceed according to logic that differed from traditional military planning. These overlapping jurisdictions created both opportunities and complications that would shape American foreign policy for decades. The early CIA also inherited from the OSS a culture that valued innovation and improvisation over rigid adherence to bureaucratic procedures. Operations that achieved their objectives were considered successful regardless of whether they followed established protocols. This results-oriented approach encouraged creative thinking about influence operations. But it also created an environment where activities could develop in directions that hadn't been anticipated by policymakers who authorized the original operations. The men who worked in those early CIA offices understood that they were participating in something historically significant. America had never maintained a large-scale intelligence service during peacetime, and they were creating the institutional culture that would define how such an organization operated in a democratic society. The decisions they made about operational methods, ethical boundaries, and relationships with other institutions would establish precedents that would influence American intelligence work for generations. The transition from wartime OSS to peacetime CIA represented more than just organizational continuity. It marked America's recognition that the techniques developed for fighting fascism might be permanently necessary for containing communism. The skills that had been justified as temporary, wartime expedients were being institutionalized as permanent features of American statecraft, and among those skills, the ability to influence public opinion through subtle manipulation of information sources would prove to be one of the most controversial and most enduring. The stage was being set for operations that would extend far beyond foreign countries and foreign audiences. The logic of influence operations, once accepted as necessary for international competition, would inevitably be applied to domestic considerations as well, and the institution that was taking shape in those unmarked office buildings would soon discover that the line between foreign and domestic information operations was far less clear than its creators had assumed. The birth of the CIA had not been celebrated with parades or public speeches. Its existence was quietly acknowledged in the corners of government offices, in the hushed conversations of men who had been trained to operate in secrecy. But even in this low-profile beginning, the agency carried the weight of enormous expectations, guarding the nation against threats that were invisible, yet potentially catastrophic. Those early officers understood that success would require patience and subtlety. Brute force had little place in the strategies they were developing. Influence, persuasion, and the careful shaping of perception became the tools of their trade. Each operation, whether abroad or at home, was an exercise in timing, narrative control, and the quiet alignment of interests that might otherwise remain at odds. The merging of espionage and communication set a precedent that would ripple through the following decades. Relationships with journalists, academics, and industry leaders were carefully cultivated. The seeds planted in those first years would bear fruit in ways that the founders might never have fully anticipated, shaping public opinion, policy, and international perceptions with a precision that rivaled any military campaign. By the late 1940s, the CIA had begun to define its role not only as a collector of secrets, but as a shaper of realities. The lessons of Europe, the legal flexibility of the National Security Act, and the professional expertise of its personnel combined to create an organization capable of operating across borders, media, and minds. The transformation from spies to spin doctors was underway, and the implications would echo throughout American culture and policy for decades to come. In those days, we began to understand that the real war was not being fought with tanks and bombers, but with words and ideas drifting across international airwaves like competing songs in the night. The crackle of Radio Moscow broadcasts jamming American signals became as familiar as the evening news, a constant reminder that somewhere beyond the static, other voices were telling different stories about the same world we thought we understood. The Soviets had turned propaganda into a science, spending what intelligence analysts estimated at $3.5 to $4 billion annually on operations designed to shape global opinion about America and its allies. That was more money than many small countries spent on their entire government operations, dedicated solely to the patient, systematic work of changing minds and influencing decisions in places where no Soviet soldier would ever set foot. I remember the way those Soviet operations felt to Americans who encountered them overseas, and not crude or obvious, but sophisticated and carefully tailored to local conditions and concerns. A newspaper article in Cairo that happened to mention American racial problems alongside coverage of regional politics, a radio broadcast in New Delhi that presented economic statistics in ways that made capitalism appear unstable and exploitative. A film festival in Rome that featured movies depicting American society as violent and spiritually empty. Each individual item seemed innocuous, but together they created an atmosphere of subtle but persistent criticism. The front organizations that Moscow created and supported were masterpieces of deception. The World Peace Council, with its headquarters in Vienna, looked like an authentic international movement dedicated to preventing nuclear war. The International Union of Students, based in Prague, appeared to represent the genuine interests of young people around the world seeking educational opportunities and cultural exchange. The World Federation of Trade Unions seemed like a natural expression of international worker solidarity. Only careful investigation revealed the ways that Soviet intelligence services guided their activities and shaped their public positions. The forgeries were even more sophisticated. Documents that appeared to be leaked American government communications, containing just enough authentic detail to seem credible, while including fabricated elements designed to embarrass the United States or damage relationships with allies, business correspondence that seemed to reveal American corporate plans for economic exploitation of developing countries, military communications that suggested aggressive intentions toward neutral nations. These forgeries were distributed through networks that made their Soviet origins almost impossible to trace. The disinformation campaigns targeted America's most vulnerable points with surgical precision. Every instance of racial discrimination became evidence of fundamental hypocrisy in American claims about freedom and equality. Every example of economic inequality was presented as proof that capitalism inevitably created exploitation and suffering. Every foreign policy initiative was interpreted as evidence of American imperialism and aggression. The Soviets understood that the most effective propaganda contained elements of truth, making their fabrications much harder to dismiss or refute. American vulnerability on racial issues was particularly acute during these years. While the United States was proclaiming its commitment to freedom and democracy around the world, segregation laws in the American South created situations that were genuinely difficult to defend or explain. Soviet propagandists didn't need to exaggerate or fabricate when they could simply photograph lunch counters with whites-only signs or quote directly from speeches by American politicians defending racial separation. The contradiction between American ideals and American reality created opportunities that Soviet propagandists exploited with devastating effectiveness. The economic dimensions of this information warfare were equally complex. The Marshall Plan and other American aid programs were presented by Soviet propaganda as forms of economic imperialism designed to create dependencies rather than promote genuine development. American business investments in foreign countries were described as exploitation that benefited only American corporations, while leaving local populations worse off than before. Even humanitarian aid was portrayed as serving hidden political objectives rather than addressing genuine human need. Cultural exchange programs became battlegrounds where competing ideologies struggled for influence over international audiences. When American jazz musicians toured overseas under State Department sponsorship, Soviet propagandists suggested that this represented cynical manipulation of African American artists by a government that denied them basic civil rights at home. When American universities offered scholarships to foreign students, these programs were described as efforts to indoctrinate future foreign leaders with capitalist ideology and American political perspectives. The scientific and technological competition between the superpowers provided another arena for propaganda warfare. Soviet achievements in space exploration were presented as evidence of the superiority of socialist economic planning and education systems. American scientific failures were publicized extensively, while American successes were minimized or ignored. The atomic bomb, rather than being presented as a deterrent to Soviet aggression, was portrayed as evidence of American willingness to commit genocide against civilian populations. Religious freedom became another point of attack in Soviet propaganda operations, while the United States proclaimed its commitment to religious liberty. Soviet propagandists highlighted instances of religious discrimination and presented American society as dominated by commercial materialism that undermined authentic spiritual values. The persecution of religious minorities in America was contrasted with claimed religious tolerance in the Soviet Union, creating narratives that were difficult to counter effectively. The international labor movement provided particularly fertile ground for Soviet influence operations. Many trade unions around the world had historical connections to socialist and communist political movements, creating natural channels for Soviet messaging about economic inequality and worker exploitation. American foreign policy positions that seemed to support authoritarian regimes in developing countries were presented as evidence that the United States opposed genuine worker rights and social justice. American intelligence analysts studying these Soviet operations began to understand that traditional approaches to international communication were inadequate for competing effectively in this new environment. Official government statements and formal diplomatic communications reached only limited audiences and carried obvious biases that reduced their credibility with neutral observers. What was needed were influence operations that could shape international opinion through channels that appeared independent and objective rather than obviously governmental. The news media emerged as a crucial battlefield in this competition for international opinion. Foreign correspondents for major newspapers and magazines reached educated, influential audiences in countries where their reporting might affect political decisions and policy choices. These journalists had credibility that official government sources lacked, and their reports were seen as independent observations rather than propaganda. If these reporters could be influenced to present American policies and perspectives favorably, their work might counter Soviet propaganda more effectively than any government information program. Academic institutions represented another important target for influence operations. University professors and researchers had access to influential audiences through their teaching and publications, and their academic credentials gave them credibility when they spoke about international affairs. Graduate students who might become future political leaders in their home countries were exposed to American perspectives through their educational experiences, potentially creating long-term advantages for American policy objectives. Cultural organizations provided additional opportunities for subtle influence operations. Art exhibitions, musical performances, and literary events reached audiences that might be suspicious of obvious political messaging, but were open to cultural expressions that happened to present American society in positive ways. These cultural programs could create emotional connections and positive associations that were more powerful than rational arguments about policy positions. The business community offered still another channel for influence operations. American corporations operating internationally had relationships with local partners, government officials, and media outlets that could be leveraged for broader policy objectives. Business publications and trade associations reached influential audiences in the economic sectors that often determined political decisions about international cooperation and alignment. The challenge for American intelligence planners was to develop operations that could compete effectively with Soviet influence campaigns without appearing to violate American principles about freedom of expression and independent journalism. The solution that emerged was to work through existing institutions rather than creating obvious government propaganda programs. If journalists, academics, and cultural leaders could be encouraged to present American perspectives as their own independent conclusions, their influence would be far more effective than anything that carried obvious government sponsorship. This approach required a level of sophistication and subtlety that had not been necessary during wartime, when American propaganda could be openly patriotic and anti-fascist without apology. The Cold War demanded influence operations that were invisible to their targets, programs that achieved their objectives while maintaining plausible deniability about government involvement. The techniques that had been developed for wartime resistance movements would now be applied to peacetime competition for international opinion. The men who designed these operations understood that they were entering territory that raised complex questions about the relationship between government and civil society in a democratic system. If intelligence agencies began influencing domestic institutions like universities and news organizations, where would such activities end? How could democratic oversight be maintained over operations that required secrecy to be effective? These were questions that would become more pressing as the programs expanded and their implications became clearer. But in those early days of the Cold War, such concerns seemed secondary to the immediate challenge of competing effectively with Soviet propaganda operations that were already achieving significant successes around the world. The battle for hearts and minds had begun, and America was discovering that winning required weapons as subtle and sophisticated as anything in the Soviet arsenal. The stage was being set for operations that would blur the line between journalism and intelligence work in ways that would reshape American media and democratic discourse for decades to come. The credibility of reporters, the independence of universities, and the trust of the public were all potential tools in a contest that required discretion, patience, and an understanding of human psychology. The new great game had begun, and the rules were still being written. Analysts, operatives, and journalists all played parts in a theater where perception could matter more than reality, where stories could carry as much weight as armies, and where the most effective victories were invisible victories that shaped minds rather than borders. Every broadcast, every article, every academic lecture could be leveraged to advance national objectives. Subtle guidance, carefully placed narratives, and patient cultivation of influence became the hallmarks of American strategy. And in this emerging battlefield, the most important skill was understanding not just events, but how they would be perceived around the world. The Cold War had transformed the very notion of warfare. Victory was no longer simply a matter of defeating armies or capturing territory. It required shaping perceptions, influencing beliefs, and quietly winning the loyalty of hearts and minds on a global scale. The game had begun, and the players were only just discovering how far it would reach. Frank Wisner was the kind of man who seemed to carry electricity in his fingertips. I remember hearing about his boundless, almost maniacal energy, the way he threw himself into the work of fighting communism with the fervor of a true believer. The sound of Frank Wisner's restless pacing through CIA corridors became as familiar as the whisper of classified documents being shuffled in late-night strategy sessions, a constant rhythm that seemed to match the urgency he felt about America's position in the emerging Cold War. Back then, Wisner's office felt like the nerve center of something vast and ambitious. Walls lined with maps marked in ways that meant nothing to casual visitors, but everything to the men who understood the global scope of his operations. The air in those rooms carried the scent of strong coffee and cigarette smoke. The atmosphere of men working against deadlines that were measured not in weeks or months, but in the time it might take for communist movements to gain irreversible momentum in countries whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. His recruitment into the intelligence world had followed a path that would become familiar among the men who shaped Cold War covert operations. George Kennan, the diplomat and strategic thinker who had articulated the doctrine of containment, recognized in Wisner the kind of operational energy that theoretical frameworks required if they were to become effective policy. Kennan understood that containing communism would require more than diplomatic protests and economic aid programs. It would need men willing to work in the shadows where traditional statecraft ended and something more creative began. Wisner brought to this work the institutional memory of the Office of Strategic Services, where he had learned that successful operations required not just careful planning, but the kind of personal commitment that could sustain complex, long-term efforts despite setbacks and complications. His wartime experience in the Balkans had taught him that political outcomes could be influenced through patient cultivation of local contacts, strategic distribution of resources, and careful coordination of activities that appeared unrelated to outside observers, but worked together to create desired results. The creation of the Office of Policy Coordination in 1948 represented something new in American government and organization. explicitly designed to conduct covert operations that would influence political developments around the world without leaving obvious fingerprints of American involvement. The OPC's mandate was sweeping in its scope and deliberately vague in its boundaries, authorizing activities that ranged from propaganda and economic warfare to support for resistance movements and political action operations in foreign countries. Wisner understood that this mandate created unprecedented opportunities, but also unprecedented responsibilities. The men working under his direction would be operating in environments where traditional rules of engagement didn't apply, where success often depended on maintaining cover stories and false identities, where the most effective operations were often those that achieved their objectives without anyone realizing that an operation had taken place at all. His approach to covert operations reflected what colleagues described as his total commitment philosophy. Wisner believed that the communist threat was so serious and so immediate that it justified methods that might have seemed excessive under normal circumstances. Half measures and cautious approaches would fail against opponents who were willing to use every available tool to advance their objectives. The office spaces where this work was conducted had their own particular atmosphere. Conference rooms where operational plans were developed using maps and charts that couldn't be seen by unauthorized personnel. Communications centers where encrypted messages coordinated activities across multiple continents. Archives where the documentation of successful operations was stored, alongside the lessons learned from failures and the personnel that Wisner recruited for OPC operations were drawn from backgrounds that prepared them for the complex challenges of peacetime covert action. Academics who understood the intellectual dimensions of ideological competition, businessmen who could provide commercial cover for intelligence activities, journalists who could gather information while appearing to pursue normal professional activities, cultural figures who could influence opinion through their artistic and literary work. Training programs for OPC operatives emphasized skills that went far beyond traditional espionage tradecraft, learning how to establish and maintain false identities, how to create front organizations that would withstand casual scrutiny, how to distribute funds without creating paper trails that could expose operational details, how to coordinate with foreign contacts without compromising their safety or effectiveness. The Iran operation of 1953 became a showcase for Wisner's operational philosophy and methods. The overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was achieved through a combination of propaganda operations, economic pressure, political manipulation, and carefully orchestrated demonstrations that created the appearance of popular uprising against a government that had actually enjoyed significant public support. The operation's success validated Wisner's belief that properly coordinated covert action could achieve results that would be impossible through conventional, diplomatic, or military means. The Guatemala operation of 1954 demonstrated the sophistication that OPC operations had achieved under Wisner's leadership. The overthrow of President Jacobo Arbenz involved psychological warfare campaigns, radio broadcasts from clandestine transmitters, arms shipments to opposition groups, diplomatic pressure through international organizations, and media manipulation that shaped how these events were reported in American newspapers and magazines. These successes established Wisner's reputation as someone who could deliver results in situations where traditional policy tools had proven inadequate. but they also created expectations for continued success that would eventually prove impossible to meet. The methods that worked in relatively small countries with weak governments and limited international connections would prove far more difficult to apply in situations involving major powers or well-established political systems. Wisner's personal style reflected the intensity he brought to this work. Colleagues remember his ability to work 18-hour days for weeks at a time, his capacity for absorbing enormous amounts of detailed information about complex international situations, his skill at identifying operational opportunities that less experienced officers might overlook. But they also remember signs of the psychological pressure that this work created: the insomnia, the chain smoking, the difficulty in separating professional concerns from personal anxieties. The scope of operations that fell under Wisner's direction expanded rapidly as the Cold War intensified. What had begun as relatively limited efforts to influence political developments in specific countries evolved into a global network of activities that included propaganda operations, cultural programs, economic warfare, political action campaigns, and support for resistance movements. Managing this expansion required organizational skills that went far beyond traditional military or diplomatic experience. The relationship between OPC and other government agencies was often complicated by jurisdictional questions and competing priorities. State Department officials found that their diplomatic initiatives might be affected by covert operations they hadn't been informed about in advance. Military commanders discovered that activities in their areas of responsibility were being conducted according to logic they didn't fully understand. These coordination challenges would become more serious as operations expanded and their implications became more complex. The budgetary arrangements that supported Wisner's operations were as creative as the operations themselves. Funds were channeled through multiple agencies and accounts in ways that obscured their ultimate purposes and made oversight extremely difficult. This financial flexibility allowed rapid response to emerging opportunities, but it also created possibilities for activities to expand far beyond their original scope without normal budgetary controls coming into play. Media operations became an increasingly important component of Wisner's overall strategy. He understood that public opinion in target countries could be influenced more effectively through news stories and cultural programs than through obvious propaganda. This meant developing relationships with journalists, editors, publishers, and media executives who could be persuaded to present American perspectives as their own independent editorial judgments, rather than as foreign government messaging. The techniques developed for foreign media operations inevitably raised questions about their potential application to American media outlets. If these methods were effective for influencing opinion in other countries, wouldn't they be equally effective for countering Soviet propaganda efforts directed at American audiences? The logic of covert action, once accepted as necessary for international competition, created pressures for domestic applications that would prove difficult to resist. Wisner's eventual breakdown and suicide reflected the personal cost of conducting operations that required maintaining multiple layers of deception while taking responsibility for activities whose success or failure could affect the global balance of power. The psychological pressure of coordinating operations across multiple continents, managing networks of agents whose safety depended on operational security, and making decisions based on incomplete information in situations where mistakes could have catastrophic consequences proved unsustainable even for someone with his extraordinary energy and commitment. But the institutional framework that Wisner created and the operational methods he developed would outlast his personal involvement and continue to shape American intelligence activities for decades. The Office of Policy Coordination established precedents for covert action that would influence how subsequent operations were planned and executed. The relationships with media figures that were developed during his tenure would continue to provide channels for influence operations long after the specific circumstances that created them had changed. The legacy of Frank Wisner's work was a government capability for conducting sophisticated influence operations that could shape political developments around the world through means that were invisible to their targets and deniable by their sponsors. Among these capabilities, the ability to influence news coverage and public opinion through relationships with journalists and media executives would prove to be one of the most controversial and most enduring aspects of Cold War covert action. The network of operations that Wisner helped establish encompassed propaganda, cultural influence, political action, and covert support for sympathetic groups. These activities were coordinated globally, reflecting a strategy that relied on multiple simultaneous efforts to achieve strategic objectives without direct military engagement. Wisner's work illustrated the merging of intelligence with media influence, demonstrating that controlling perception could be as impactful as controlling territory. This philosophy would shape CIA strategies for decades, influencing approaches to both foreign and domestic information campaigns. Ultimately, the Cold War landscape that Wisner navigated was one in which conventional warfare had been replaced by the subtler battle for hearts and minds. The lessons learned in his offices through his strategies and networks laid the groundwork for an era in which influence, secrecy, and the control of information became central tools of statecraft. Cordmeyer had once believed in world peace with the passion of a man who had seen war's true face. But the Cold War had a way of transforming even the most idealistic souls, turning former pacifists into warriors of a different kind. The quiet click of checks being written to front organizations became as familiar as the sound of his fountain pen signing articles for liberal magazines, each signature marking another step in his journey from public advocacy for world government to clandestine operations designed to preserve American influence in an increasingly dangerous world. I remember the way people described Cordmeyer in those days tall league, with the kind of intellectual intensity that made conversation partners lean forward to catch every carefully chosen word. He had lost an eye to Japanese shrapnel on Guam, and those who knew him said the patch he wore seemed to accentuate rather than diminish the penetrating quality of his remaining gaze. There was something in his manner that suggested a man who had confronted mortality and emerged with a deeper understanding of what stakes were worth fighting for. His transformation from World Federalist to Cold War operative reflected the broader evolution of American liberalism during those years. The men and women who had emerged from World War II believing that international cooperation and mutual understanding could prevent future conflicts found themselves confronting a Soviet Union that seemed determined to exploit every gesture of goodwill, every attempt at compromise, every expression of idealistic hope for peaceful coexistence. The office where Meyer worked in the CIA's international organizations Division carried the atmosphere of scholarly research rather than traditional espionage operations. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with academic journals, policy studies, and reports from think tanks and universities around the world. The work conducted there required the kind of intellectual analysis that Meyer had learned during his years at Yale and Cambridge, but applied to objectives that his former professors might have found difficult to understand or approve. The distribution of clandestine funds through front groups required a level of financial sophistication that went far beyond simple cash payments to foreign agents. Meyer's operations involved creating networks of foundations, cultural organizations, and political groups that could receive CIA money without knowing its ultimate source, then use those funds for activities that advanced American interests while appearing to represent authentic grassroots movements or independent intellectual initiatives. The National Student Association funding scandal of 1967 would eventually reveal some of the techniques that Meyer's division had perfected during the previous decade. Student leaders who had believed they were receiving support from progressive foundations and liberal donors discovered that their travel expenses, conference costs, and program budgets had actually been provided by the Central Intelligence Agency through a complex network of front organizations and intermediary groups. But the student operations were just one small part of a much larger program that included labor unions, civil rights organizations, academic institutions, cultural foundations, and media outlets. Each of these operations required careful attention to maintaining cover stories that would withstand casual scrutiny, while providing channels for influence that could shape political and cultural developments in directions favorable to American interests. The use of cutouts and intermediary organizations was essential to maintaining plausible deniability about CIA involvement in these activities. A foundation established with CIA funds would make grants to university programs that happened to promote research supporting American foreign policy positions. A cultural organization receiving CIA support would sponsor art exhibitions and literary events that presented American society in positive terms to international audiences. A media company with CIA connections would produce films and publications that countered Soviet propaganda without acknowledging their intelligence agency sponsorship. Meyer understood that the most effective influence operations were those that aligned with the genuine beliefs and interests of the people and organizations being supported, rather than trying to convince liberals to adopt conservative positions or asking academics to promote ideas they found intellectually dubious. The key was to identify individuals and groups whose authentic convictions happened to serve American strategic objectives, then provide them with resources and opportunities to express those convictions more effectively. This approach required extensive knowledge of the intellectual and cultural landscape in target countries, understanding which writers and artists and political figures had credibility with important audiences, which organizations had genuine grassroots support that could be leveraged for broader political purposes, which ideas and arguments would resonate with specific populations under particular circumstances. The international conferences that Meyer's division sponsored were masterpieces of subtle influence, gatherings of intellectuals, artists, and political leaders from around the world who believed they were participating in independent cultural exchange or academic collaboration, while the actual agenda, funding, and logistical support came from CIA sources working through multiple layers of front organizations and intermediary groups. These conferences served multiple intelligence functions simultaneously. They provided opportunities for CIA officers to make contact with potentially useful individuals from foreign countries. They created forums where American perspectives on international issues could be presented as the independent conclusions of respected intellectual figures. They generated publications and media coverage that reached influential audiences in countries where direct American propaganda would have been dismissed as biased or self. The psychological operations that Maya coordinated were particularly sophisticated in their understanding of how ideas spread through intellectual and cultural networks. A scholarly article published in an obscure academic journal might eventually influence policy decisions in foreign capitals if it was read by the right graduate students who would become government officials, or cited in other publications that reached broader audiences, or discussed at conferences attended by journalists who would incorporate its arguments into their news coverage. The media operations that fell under Maya's supervision represented some of the most controversial aspects of the CIA's domestic activities. While the agency's charter prohibited operations directed at American audiences, the practical reality of international communications meant that influence efforts targeting foreign populations inevitably affected American public opinion as well. A news story planted in a European newspaper might be picked up by American media outlets, creating what intelligence professionals called blowback that influenced domestic political debate. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, one of the most successful front organizations sponsored by Maya's division, demonstrated how cultural activities could serve strategic political objectives. This international organization brought together writers, artists, and intellectuals from around the world for conferences, exhibitions, and publications that promoted Western values and democratic ideals while providing subtle but effective counter-arguments to Soviet propaganda themes. The funding mechanisms that supported these operations required constant attention to maintaining cover stories that would withstand investigation by suspicious journalists or hostile intelligence services. Money moved through networks of foundations and holding companies disguised as charitable contributions or business investments, channeled through accounts that obscured their ultimate CIA origins, while providing the resources necessary for complex, long-term influence operations. Maya's personal commitment to these operations reflected his belief that they represented a more civilized form of international competition than military confrontation or economic warfare. Rather than using force or coercion to achieve American objectives, these programs worked through persuasion and intellectual influence, supporting ideas and individuals who shared American values while opposing those who promoted authoritarian alternatives. The ethical questions raised by these operations were complex and often ambiguous. Was it wrong to provide financial support to organizations and individuals who were already promoting ideas that served American interests? If Soviet intelligence services were conducting similar operations with far more cynical objectives, didn't American intelligence agencies have a responsibility to compete in the same arena with methods that were less crude and more respectful of individual autonomy? The long-term effectiveness of Maya's operations was difficult to measure. because their success depended on maintaining secrecy about their sponsorship and objectives. A cultural program that achieved its goals while preserving its cover might continue influencing opinion for years or decades after its CIA funding ended. An academic who had been supported by CIA front organizations might continue advocating positions that served American interests long after the original relationship had been forgotten. The psychological toll of conducting these operations was significant for the officers involved. Meyer and his colleagues were required to maintain elaborate deceptions about their work, not just with foreign contacts, but often with close friends and family members, who couldn't be told the true nature of their activities. This need for constant secrecy created isolation and stress that affected both professional effectiveness and personal relationships. The institutional culture that developed within the International Organizations Division reflected the complexity of its mission. Officers needed to combine the analytical skills of academic researchers with the operational security awareness of traditional intelligence operatives, while maintaining the kind of personal credibility that would allow them to function effectively in intellectual and cultural circles that valued authenticity and independent thinking. The connection between Meyer's operations and the alleged Operation Mockingbird remains a subject of historical debate. While there is no documentary evidence of a program specifically called Operation Mockingbird, the activities conducted by Meyer's division certainly included efforts to influence media coverage through relationships with journalists, editors and publishers who were either witting or unwitting participants in CIA influence operations. The legacy of Claude Meyer's work was a sophisticated understanding of how ideas and information could be used as instruments of foreign policy, and an operational capability for conducting influence operations that shaped political and cultural developments around the world, through means that were largely invisible to their targets and the general public. These capabilities would continue to be used long after the specific Cold War circumstances that created them had changed, raising questions about their appropriateness in a democratic society that would never be fully resolved. The recruitment of journalists and intellectuals into the CIA's orbit was less a matter of clandestine operations than of social osmosis. In the drawing rooms of Georgetown, amid the clink of ice in highball glasses and the smoke of Turkish cigarettes, friendships formed that would carry enormous political weight. It was not that the CIA infiltrated the intelligentsia, rather the intelligentsia, through old-school ties and wartime service, often overlapped with the very men now running America's secret wars abroad. To understand how this network functioned, one must picture the architecture of elite society at mid-century. Universities such as Yale, Harvard, and Princeton were not just educational institutions, but pipelines of influence, their graduates dispersing into law firms, government offices, publishing houses, and editorial boards. The same class that produced foreign correspondents also produced spies, and often the two roles were filled by the same individuals at different points in their careers. What made this integration possible was not ideology alone, but trust. A correspondent who had shared a foxhole in Italy or a convoy to Murmansk with a man now in the agency's Soviet division would not need elaborate vetting to be considered reliable. Likewise, editors who had come up through the same prep schools as the men on the National Security Council found it only natural to take a phone call asking for discretion on a sensitive story. The journalists drawn into this circle often justified their cooperation on professional grounds, Access to information was the lifeblood of their trade, and the CIA could offer unparalleled insights into the hidden movements of the world. In exchange for suppressing certain details or shading a report in a desired direction, they were rewarded with tips, background briefings, or the chance to travel on agency-sponsored junkets. The line between cooperation and co-optation blurred. The most prized recruits were foreign correspondents. Stationed abroad, they had access to diplomatic circles, local dissidents, and the shifting tides of public opinion. A well-placed correspondent in Paris, Rome, or Jakarta could gather intelligence as effectively as any case officer, while also shaping narratives back home through the columns they filed. In some instances, the journalists' reports served double duty, appearing in print for the public and in classified briefings for the agency. It was not always a formal arrangement. Some correspondents were on the CIA's payroll, receiving envelopes of cash or consultancy retainers. Others cooperated out of conviction, believing that to assist the agency was to strengthen the free world against communism. Still, others drifted into the role without ever fully acknowledging the compromises they had made. The ambiguity suited the agency well. It thrived in the gray spaces where allegiance and ambition blurred. In Washington, the relationships between editors and agency officers were often marked by mutual convenience. An editor could spike or soften a story that risked exposing sensitive operations, while, in return, the paper might receive exclusive scoops on foreign developments. These exchanges rarely appeared on ledgers, but they shaped the boundaries of public knowledge, defining what Americans were permitted to read about their country's role in the world. For the agency, the appeal of cultural figures went beyond journalism. Novelists, critics, and professors were enlisted as well, their reputations lending credibility to publications and conferences financed covertly by Langley through such intermediaries. The CIA sought not only to counter communist propaganda, but to define the very contours of intellectual life in the post-war West. The intellectuals who joined these ventures did not always perceive themselves as agents of the state. Many believed they were defending the autonomy of art and scholarship against totalitarianism. Yet their independence was compromised the moment the source of their funding was concealed. For influence, once accepted, has a way of shaping the mind as surely as the pen shapes the page. The recruitment of the elite, therefore, was not an act of conquest, but of persuasion. It relied on subtle appeals to loyalty, friendship, and the shared sense that civilization itself hung in the balance. The men who accepted these roles did not see themselves as puppets, but as guardians of a fragile order, standing watch against the encroachment of tyranny. History would judge their compromises more harshly than they judged themselves. By the mid-1950s, the CIA's network of media contacts had grown so extensive that few corners of the press were untouched. Newspapers of record, glossy magazines, and even radio broadcasters had, at one time or another, carried stories that bore the fingerprints of Langley. It was an empire of influence without borders, one that extended across the Atlantic into Europe and reached into the newly independent states of Asia and Africa. Such efforts were not merely reactive. They were proactive campaigns designed to ensure that American ideals were always given the widest platform, while reports of U.S. missteps or covert operations were minimized or quietly buried. In this way, the Cold War was not only fought in the shadows of intelligence, gathering but also in the minds of readers sipping their morning coffee. Some journalists bristled at these quiet manipulations, recognizing the compromises being made to their profession. A few refused outright, unwilling to allow their bylines to be weaponized, but others rationalized their participation, telling themselves that the defense of democracy justified the bending of journalistic standards. In smoky press rooms and late-night bars, these arguments played out with a bitterness that never fully disappeared. To the agency, the risks were clear. A single could unravel years of work, discrediting not only the reporters involved, but the publications themselves. Secrecy was paramount, and the names of cooperating journalists were guarded with the same care as any sensitive intelligence source. They were not simply writers, they were assets. The journalists themselves walked a perilous line. To be caught in collaboration with the CIA risked not only professional ruin, but personal danger, for in the Cold War's climate of suspicion, an accusation of espionage could end careers or even lives. Yet the rewards access, prestige, and the intoxicating sense of being on history's inside track were often too great to resist. For the agency, cultivating journalists was as much about shaping perception as gathering intelligence. Each carefully placed article or op-ed could steer conversations in capitals thousands of miles away. By subtly influencing public discourse, the CIA aimed to create a world more receptive to American foreign policy, a landscape where ideas themselves became instruments of national strategy. The ethical ambiguity of these operations weighed on some participants. While some reporters reconciled their actions with patriotism, others wrestled with the knowledge that their integrity could be compromised. Yet the pressure of global stakes, coupled with the allure of exclusive access, created a climate in which compromise was inevitable and secrecy absolute. The social rituals of recruitment cocktail parties, private luncheons, and formal dinners served dual purposes. They allowed agency officers to evaluate temperament, loyalty, and discretion, while offering journalists a sense of belonging to an elite circle. Over time, these gatherings became more than networking. They were laboratories for cultivating influence and subtly guiding opinion. The agency's investment in these human networks paid dividends across continents. Reports from correspondents influenced policy decisions, and the subtle promotion of American cultural values created a buffer against Soviet propaganda. Each journalist, editor, or cultural figure operated as a node in a complex web, translating professional expertise into geopolitical advantage. Ultimately, the recruitment of the elite was less about coercion and more about shared vision. Men and women who believed in the defense of democracy, who valued professional distinction, and who trusted their peers found themselves aligned with the agency's mission. The Cold War, for them, was fought not only with weapons or spies, but through the careful orchestration of knowledge, influence, and trust. The lasting impact of these operations extended well beyond the Cold War itself. Relationships forged between journalists and intelligence officers shaped the culture of news reporting, influencing which stories were pursued and how events were framed. The precedent set in these Georgetown drawing rooms echoed through decades, creating subtle patterns of influence that endured long after the immediate geopolitical battles had passed. Even after public scrutiny revealed some of these covert relationships, the full extent of the agency's reach remained opaque. while congressional hearings and investigative journalism exposed certain operations, much of the network's subtler influence had already become institutionalized, leaving patterns of interaction and trust that could not easily be undone. The moral calculus for those involved remained complex. Was collaboration an act of patriotism or a compromise of journalistic integrity? Did participating in shaping narratives for national security outweigh the potential betrayal of public trust? For many, the answer remained ambiguous, a quiet burden carried alongside professional achievement and personal conviction. Yet the human dimension of these operations, the friendships, the shared sense of duty, and the subtle persuasion exercised over drinks and meals remained central. Influence was less a matter of coercion than cultivation, a delicate balance of trust, shared values, and professional camaraderie that ensured cooperation while minimizing overt control. In the end, the recruitment of journalists and cultural elites was as much about preserving American values as it was about countering Soviet influence. It was an operation waged with intellect, subtlety, and discretion, an invisible war fought through words, trust, and the careful orchestration of ideas. The legacy of those efforts would leave an indelible mark on the media landscape and on the broader understanding of the Cold War itself. For 20 years, the offices of Time Inc. and the Central Intelligence Agency operated with an intimacy that would have shocked their readers. Dispatches from foreign correspondents flowed not just to editorial desks, but to intelligence analysts who saw each photograph, each cable, as vital pieces in the global puzzle they were trying to solve. The rustle of Time magazine pages in corporate boardrooms carried with it the whispered understanding that some stories served purposes beyond informing the American public, that some assignments were coordinated with men whose names never appeared in mastheads or by. I remember the way people described the Time life building in those days. 40-8 floors of limestone and steel rising above Rockefeller Center. Its upper floors housing editorial offices where the weekly rhythm of magazine production masked more complex activities. Foreign correspondents would file their reports through channels that split in directions most journalists never suspected, with copies finding their way to unmarked offices where analysts studied them for intelligence value as carefully as editors evaluated them for news content. The relationship between Henry Luce's publishing empire and the CIA represented what investigators would later describe as a systematic policy of direct collusion, though those involved preferred to think of it as patriotic cooperation between institutions that shared common concerns about America's role in the world. The arrangement provided benefits that flowed in both directions. The CIA gained access to information and influence channels that would have been impossible to develop through traditional intelligence methods, while Time Inc. received exclusive access to sources and stories that enhanced the quality and timeliness of their coverage. The foreign correspondents who worked for Time, Life, and Fortune represented an intelligence asset of unprecedented value. These were seasoned journalists with years of experience in their assigned regions, fluent in local languages, comfortable with local customs, trusted by sources who would never speak to obvious intelligence operatives. Their press credentials provided cover for travel to sensitive areas and access to political figures who might be suspicious of American government representatives, but willing to speak candidly with journalists from respected publications. The dispatches these correspondents filed carried more than just information intended for publication. Embedded within their cables were details about political developments, economic conditions, and social tensions that had obvious intelligence value, but might never appear in the magazines their employers published. A correspondent's report on a diplomatic reception might include observations about which officials seemed nervous, which conversations were cut short when certain names were mentioned, which foreign diplomats appeared to be cultivating relationships with local communist leaders. The photo archives maintained by Life magazine represented another dimension of this cooperation that most readers never suspected. Photographers working for the publication had documented political events, military installations, and industrial facilities around the world, creating a visual record that was invaluable for intelligence analysis. Images that were rejected for publication because they were technically imperfect or editorially inappropriate might be exactly what CIA analysts needed to understand foreign military capabilities or assess political situations. Arthur Hayes Sulzberger's alleged cooperation with the CIA represented an even more significant relationship because of the New York Times' unique position in American journalism. The newspaper's reputation for authoritative coverage of international affairs meant that its reporting could influence policy debates in Washington and shape public opinion about foreign policy issues. Stories that appeared in the Times were often picked up by other publications, amplified through television news broadcasts, and discussed in the kind of elite circles where policy decisions were made. The value of this relationship was reflected in intelligence assessments that described the New York Times as the most valuable newspaper connection in the CIA's media program. This was not simply because of the publication's circulation or influence, but because of the quality of its foreign correspondence network and the sophistication of its editorial coverage of international affairs. Times correspondents had access to sources and information that were unavailable to journalists working for less prestigious publications, and their reports could provide insights into foreign government policies and intentions that were difficult to obtain through traditional intelligence channels. The television networks presented different opportunities and challenges for CIA media operations. CBS, ABC, and NBC were developing international news capabilities that would eventually rival those of the major newspapers and magazines. But in the 1950s and early 1960s, their foreign coverage was still relatively limited. The alleged relationships that developed between the networks and the CIA reflected both the growing importance of television news and the agency's recognition that broadcast media could reach audiences that newspapers and magazines might not influence. The provision of journalistic cover for CIA operatives represented one of the most controversial aspects of these relationships. Intelligence officers operating under journalistic credentials could travel to sensitive areas, conduct meetings with foreign contacts, and gather information while maintaining cover stories that would withstand casual scrutiny. This practice provided operational advantages for the CIA, but it also put legitimate journalists at risk by creating suspicions about the true purposes of anyone carrying press credentials in areas where intelligence activities were suspected. The ethical implications of using journalistic cover were complex and often ambiguous. If a CIA operative posing as a journalist gathered accurate information and reported it truthfully, was the deception really harmful to journalistic integrity? If the operatives' activities helped prevent conflicts or human rights abuses, didn't the positive outcomes justify the means used to achieve them? These questions would become more pressing as the extent of such operations became public knowledge. But during the height of the Cold War, they seemed secondary to the immediate challenge of competing effectively with Soviet intelligence operations. The coordination required to maintain these relationships without compromising operational security was extraordinarily complex. Editorial decisions that might seem routine to outside observers sometimes involved consultations with intelligence officers who could provide context about the strategic implications of particular stories. Foreign assignments that appeared to be based purely on news value might actually be coordinated with CIA operations that required journalistic presence in specific locations at particular times. The financial arrangements that supported some of these operations were as sophisticated as the editorial coordination. CIA front organizations provided funding for foreign bureaus, travel expenses, and special projects that enhanced the news organization's coverage capabilities while serving intelligence collection objectives. These funding mechanisms were designed to be invisible to outside observers and often to the journalists who benefited from them, creating support for activities that served both editorial and intelligence purposes without obvious conflicts of interest. The cultural programs sponsored by news organizations with CIA connections provided additional opportunities for influence operations that went beyond traditional journalism. Film documentaries, photography exhibitions, and cultural exchanges could present American perspectives to international audiences while appearing to represent independent editorial judgments rather than government propaganda. These programs reached educated, influential audiences in foreign countries who might be skeptical of obvious government messaging, but receptive to cultural presentations that appeared to reflect authentic American artistic and intellectual perspectives. The book publishing operations that were connected to some of these news organizations extended their influence into academic and intellectual circles that traditional journalism might not reach. University presses, scholarly journals, and intellectual publications could promote ideas and perspectives that supported American foreign policy objectives while maintaining the credibility that came from apparent independence from government influence. Authors and editors who were unaware of CIA connections might genuinely believe they were participating in authentic intellectual discourse, while actually contributing to sophisticated influence operations. The international conferences and symposiums that were sponsored or supported by news organizations with CIA connections provided forums where American perspectives on global issues could be presented to influential audiences from around the world. These gatherings brought together journalists, academics, cultural figures, and political leaders in settings that encouraged informal exchanges of ideas and the development of personal relationships that could be valuable for both editorial and intelligence purposes. The training programs that some news organizations developed for foreign journalists created additional opportunities for influence operations that could have long-term strategic value. Young journalists from developing countries who received training in American newsrooms and journalism schools would return to their home countries with professional skills, personal contacts, and intellectual perspectives that might influence their future coverage of issues affecting American interests. These programs appeared to serve legitimate educational purposes while actually functioning as subtle influence operations with potential benefits that might not become apparent for years or decades. The technology sharing that occurred between news organizations and intelligence agencies reflected the overlap between journalism and intelligence collection in the modern world. Communications, equipment, surveillance techniques, and information processing methods developed for one purpose could often be adapted for the other. This technical cooperation created efficiencies for both organizations while blurring the boundaries between their activities in ways that would become controversial as their extent became known. The personnel exchanges that occurred between news organizations and intelligence agencies represented another dimension of their cooperation that was largely invisible to outside observers. Journalists with useful skills and experience might take temporary assignments with government agencies, while intelligence officers with relevant backgrounds might work for news organizations under arrangements that served both editorial and operational purposes. These exchanges created networks of relationships and shared experiences that reinforced cooperation between the organizations long after specific assignments ended. The influence operations that were conducted through news organizations with CIA connections were most effective when they aligned with the authentic editorial judgments and professional interests of the journalists involved, rather than asking reporters and editors to promote positions they found unconvincing. The key was to provide them with information and access that would help them reach conclusions that happened to serve American strategic objectives. This approach preserved journalistic integrity while achieving intelligence purposes in ways that were sustainable over long periods. The global reach of American news organizations made them uniquely valuable for intelligence operations that required international coordination. A story that appeared in an American publication might be picked up by foreign media outlets, translated into local languages, and discussed in political circles where it could influence policy decisions and public opinion. This multiplier effect meant that a single article or broadcast could have impacts far beyond its original audience, creating influence that extended across multiple countries and regions. The credibility that American journalism enjoyed during this period made media operations particularly effective for countering Soviet propaganda efforts. When communist publications made claims about American policies or intentions, rebuttals that appeared in respected American news outlets carried more weight with international audiences than official government statements or obvious propaganda responses. The appearance of editorial independence made these responses more persuasive and more difficult for Soviet propagandists to dismiss or counter. The long-term consequences of these relationships between news organizations and intelligence agencies would extend far beyond the specific operations they were designed to support. The trust that readers placed in journalistic independence and objectivity would be permanently damaged when the extent of these connections became public knowledge. The credibility that American journalism had built over decades of professional development would be undermined by revelations that some of its most respected institutions had been secretly cooperating with intelligence operations in ways that served government objectives rather than purely editorial purposes. But during the height of the Cold War, such concerns seemed secondary to the immediate challenge of defending democratic institutions. against totalitarian threats that were using every available means to undermine American influence and credibility around the world. The men who authorized and maintained these relationships believed they were preserving the freedom that made independent journalism possible, even if their methods temporarily compromised the independence they were trying to protect. Whether that calculation was correct would be debated for generations, but the empire of influence they created would reshape American journalism and intelligence operations in ways that would outlast the Cold War circumstances that originally justified their existence. The art of deception had become a cornerstone of American foreign policy, though few Americans understood just how sophisticated these operations had become. Stories were planted like seeds in foreign soil, designed to bloom into public opinion that would topple governments or shape elections. The scratch of printing presses producing false stories in Tehran became as familiar as the whisper of radio transmissions carrying fabricated news across international borders, each lie carefully crafted to serve strategic objectives that could never be acknowledged in congressional hearings or diplomatic cables. I remember the way those operations felt to the men who planned them, not as cynical exercises in deception, but as necessary tools for defending democratic institutions against opponents who had no qualms about using every available weapon in the arsenal of modern propaganda warfare. The filing cabinets in CIA offices contained detailed studies of successful Soviet disinformation campaigns, analyses of how false stories could spread through international media networks, assessments of which audiences were most susceptible to particular kinds of fabricated information. The Iran operation of 1953 served as a laboratory for testing techniques that would be refined and applied in dozens of other countries over the following decades. The overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh required more than just political manipulation and economic pressure. It demanded a comprehensive information warfare campaign that could convince both Iranian and international audiences that a popular democratic leader was actually a dangerous communist sympathizer who threatened regional stability and Western interests. The newspapers that appeared on Tehran street corners during those crucial weeks carried stories that had been written not in Iranian editorial offices, but in CIA safe houses where American operatives worked with Iranian contacts to create narratives that would justify the coup that was already being planned. Articles about Mossadegh's alleged connections to Soviet intelligence services, reports of communist infiltration into his government, claims that nationalization of the oil industry was actually part of a broader Soviet strategy for controlling Middle Eastern resources. All of these stories were fabricated, but they were based on enough factual details to seem credible to readers who lacked access to reliable information about their government's actual policies and intentions. The radio broadcasts that accompanied the newspaper campaign were even more sophisticated in their psychological manipulation. The voice of liberation that began transmitting to Iranian audiences wasn't broadcasting from inside Iran, but from CIA facilities that had been designed to simulate authentic local radio stations. The announcers spoke with regional accents, used local expressions and cultural references, discussed events and personalities that only genuine Iranians would know about in detail. But the content of these broadcasts was carefully crafted to create maximum political effect. Reports of government corruption that may have been partly true were exaggerated and connected to broader narratives about communist infiltration. Economic problems that had complex causes were attributed entirely to Mossadegh's policies and his alleged cooperation with Soviet advisors. Military developments that had routine explanations were presented as evidence of preparations for a communist takeover that would eliminate Iranian independence and transform the country into a Soviet satellite state. The most insidious aspect of these information operations was their use of what intelligence professionals called grey propaganda, material that combined accurate information with fabricated details in ways that made the false elements almost impossible to identify and refute. A story about a real meeting between Iranian and Soviet officials might include accurate details about the time, location, and participants, but fabricated claims about what was discussed or what agreements were reached. This technique made the propaganda far more effective than crude lies that could be easily disproven, because it exploited the natural human tendency to accept entire narratives, if significant portions appeared to be factually accurate. The Guatemala operation of 1954 demonstrated how these information warfare techniques could be applied to more complex political situations involving multiple audiences and competing narratives. The overthrow of President Jacobo Arbenz required convincing not just Guatemalan audiences, but American public opinion, other Latin American governments, and international observers that a democratically elected president was actually a communist threat to regional security and American interests. The Voice of Liberation radio station that broadcast to Guatemala during the coup was a masterpiece of psychological warfare that combined sophisticated technical capabilities with detailed understanding of local political conditions and cultural sensitivities. The station's transmitters were actually located in Nicaragua and Honduras, but the broadcasts were designed to sound like they were coming from inside Guatemala, from resistance fighters who were already active against the government. The content of these broadcasts was carefully coordinated with military and political operations on the ground. Reports of government troops defecting to the opposition were broadcast before such defections actually occurred, creating psychological pressure that often made the predictions self-fulfilling. Claims about the size and capabilities of opposition forces were exaggerated to create impressions of overwhelming strength that encouraged government supporters to abandon their positions without fighting. But the most effective element of the Guatemala information campaign was its use of apparently independent international media outlets to validate the narratives being promoted through clandestine channels. Stories that first appeared in CIA-controlled publications were picked up by legitimate news organizations, creating the appearance of multiple independent sources confirming the same basic facts about communist infiltration and the need for international intervention to preserve democratic institutions. The pornographic film that was produced as part of the operation against Indonesian President Sukarno represented an even more sophisticated application of deception techniques to character assassination objectives. Intelligence analysts had identified Sukarno's reputation as a womanizer as a potential vulnerability. But rather than simply spreading rumors about his personal behavior, they decided to create visual evidence that would be impossible for him to deny or explain away. The film used a Sukarno look-alike and professional actors to create scenes that appeared to show the Indonesian president in compromising situations that would have destroyed his political credibility if they had been accepted as snetic. The technical quality of the production was sophisticated enough to fool casual viewers, and the distribution plan involved channels that would have made the film appear to be the result of covert surveillance rather than deliberate fabrication. Although the film was never actually used because political conditions changed before it could be distributed, its creation demonstrated the lengths to which American intelligence agencies were willing to go in their efforts to influence foreign political developments. The operation also revealed the level of technical sophistication and financial resources that were being devoted to information warfare activities that most Americans knew nothing about and that would never be acknowledged in official government statements or congressional testimony. The concept of blowback became increasingly important as these information operations expanded in scope and sophistication. Stories that were created for foreign audiences inevitably found their way back to American media outlets, where they influenced domestic political debates and policy discussions in ways that hadn't been anticipated when the original deception operations were authorized. The 1965 fake weapons shipment to Vietnam provided a particularly clear example of how fabricated information created for foreign consumption could affect American policy decisions in dangerous ways. Intelligence operatives had created evidence of North Vietnamese weapons shipments to South Vietnam that were actually much larger and more sophisticated than the real supplies that were being provided to communist forces. This fabricated intelligence was designed to justify increased American military involvement and to counter international criticism of American escalation in Southeast Asia. But the false information was so convincing that it was accepted as accurate by American policymakers who used it to make decisions about military strategy and resource allocation. The result was American military planning based on threat assessments that were partly fictional, leading to tactical decisions that were inappropriate for the actual conditions American forces encountered when they were deployed to combat operations. The intelligence professionals who created these deception operations understood that they were walking a fine line between legitimate strategic communication and dangerous self-deception. The techniques that were effective for influencing foreign audiences could also influence American decision-makers. If the false information wasn't clearly identified and contained within appropriate channels, but the operational requirements for maintaining credible cover stories often made such containment impossible, creating situations where fabricated intelligence became accepted as fact by the very officials who were supposed to be served by accurate information. The psychological profiles that were developed to support these information operations represented another dimension of their sophistication that was largely invisible to outside observers. CIA analysts studied not just the political positions and policy preferences of foreign leaders, but their personal vulnerabilities, psychological tendencies, and emotional reactions to different kinds of pressure and manipulation. President Sukarno's psychology had been analyzed in detail, identifying his vanity, his need for international recognition, and his sensitivity to challenges to his masculine image as potential pressure points that could be exploited through carefully designed information operations. Similar profiles were developed for other foreign leaders, creating databases of personal information that could be used to design character assassination campaigns or psychological pressure operations tailored to individual targets. The technical capabilities that supported these information operations were far more advanced than most observers realized. Document production facilities could create authentic-looking papers for any government or organization, complete with appropriate watermarks, official seals, and signature styles. Photography laboratories could alter images in ways that were undetectable to casual examination. Audio recording equipment could create realistic simulations of telephone conversations or meeting recordings that never actually took place. Radio transmission capabilities allowed broadcasts that appeared to originate from locations where no American facilities actually existed. Printing equipment could produce newspapers and magazines that were virtually indistinguishable from authentic local publications. Film production resources could create documentaries and newsreels that presented fabricated events as if they were genuine historical records. The distribution networks that were used to spread false information were as sophisticated as the content creation capabilities. Stories would be planted in small foreign publications that were known to be monitored by major international news organizations. False documents would be leaked to journalists through intermediaries who had no knowledge of their CIA origins. Radio broadcasts would be coordinated with print media, campaigns, and political activities to create multimedia propaganda offensives that approached their targets from multiple directions simultaneously. The linguistic expertise that these operations required was enormous, involving not just translation capabilities, but deep understanding of cultural nuances, political sensitivities, and communication styles that would make fabricated material appear authentic to target audiences. CIA linguists needed to understand not just formal language skills, but regional dialects, generational differences in expression, professional vocabularies used by particular occupational groups, and cultural references that would establish credibility with specific audiences. The coordination required to maintain operational security while conducting information warfare campaigns across multiple countries and in multiple languages was extraordinarily complex. False stories needed to be consistent across different media outlets and different cultural contexts, but they also needed to be adapted to local conditions in ways that made them relevant and believable. 2. Diverse audiences with different information sources and different political concerns. The long-term consequences of these deception operations extended far beyond their immediate tactical objectives. The techniques that were developed for influencing foreign audiences established precedents and capabilities that would eventually be applied to domestic American audiences as well. The infrastructure that was created for producing and distributing false information could be used for any purpose that seemed to serve national security interests, regardless of whether those purposes were consistent with democratic principles or constitutional limitations. The institutional culture that developed around these operations normalized deception as a routine tool of statecraft, creating expectations that accurate information was less important than strategically useful information. The personnel who were trained in these techniques learned to evaluate truth and falsehood, primarily in terms of their operational effectiveness rather than their factual accuracy, creating mindsets that would influence American intelligence work for generations. The erosion of boundaries between truth and falsehood that these operations represented would eventually undermine public trust in all forms of official information, creating cynicism about government, credibility that would persist long after the specific circumstances that justified the original deception campaigns had changed. The American public would eventually discover that their government had become skilled at creating false narratives for foreign consumption, leading inevitably to questions about whether similar techniques were being used to manipulate domestic opinion as well. But during the height of the Cold War, such concerns seemed secondary to the immediate challenge of competing effectively with Soviet propaganda operations that were equally sophisticated and far more extensive in their scope and ambitions. The men who authorized and conducted these information warfare campaigns believed they were defending democratic institutions against totalitarian threats that would not hesitate to use any available weapon in their arsenal of deception and manipulation. The art of deception that they perfected would outlast the Cold War circumstances that originally justified its development, becoming a permanent feature of American statecraft with implications that would extend far beyond the foreign policy objectives it was initially designed to serve. The seeds that were planted in foreign soil during those crucial years would eventually bloom in American ground as well, creating forests of deception that would reshape the relationship between government and citizens in ways that the original architects of these operations never intended and might not have approved. The name Mockingbird itself became a symbol of the confused relationship between truth and legend in Cold War America. There were, in fact, two mockingbirds, one real and documented, the other a theory that grew in the fertile soil of genuine government deception. The whispered conversations in newsroom phone booths carried rumors that would eventually crystallize into historical claims, each hushed voice adding another layer to a story that would become as much about the power of narrative as about the actual activities it purported to describe. The confusion began with the name itself. Mockingbird was such a perfect metaphor for media manipulation, the idea of journalists as songbirds who repeated melodies composed by others, who mimicked authentic voices while serving hidden masters. The literary resonance was impossible to ignore, evoking Harper Lee's novel about moral courage and the corruption of innocence, suggesting depths of meaning that made the name feel inevitable, even if its actual origins were more prosaic than poetic. Deborah Davis understood the power of that resonance when she published Catherine the Great in 1979. Her biographical study of Washington Post publisher Katharine Graham that contained the first detailed articulation of what she called Operation Mockingbird. Davis described a systematic CIA program to recruit and control American journalists that had operated from the early 1950s through the 1970s, coordinated by figures like Frank Wisner and Cord Meyer, reaching into the highest levels of American media institutions. Her account had the compelling quality of connecting scattered facts into a coherent narrative that seemed to explain so much about the relationship between government and media during the Cold War years, the Georgetown cocktail parties, the Ivy League connections, the curious uniformity of editorial positions on foreign policy issues. Of these observations that had puzzled media critics for decades suddenly made sense if understood as components of a coordinated intelligence operation designed to shape American public opinion. But there was a problem with Davis's theory, one that wouldn't become clear until researchers began examining the documentary record more carefully in subsequent decades. While her book contained accurate descriptions of many CIA activities and relationships, she had no documentary evidence for a program specifically called Operation Mockingbird. The name appeared to be her own creation, a convenient label for activities that were real but had never been formally organized under that particular designation. The real Mockingbird was something entirely different. Wiretapping operation that had been documented in FBI and CIA files since 1963, but which had nothing to do with media manipulation or journalist recruitment. Project Mockingbird was a joint FBI-CIA surveillance program that monitored the telephone conversations of Washington columnists Robert Allen and Paul Scott, whose syndicated column Inside Washington was suspected of receiving classified information from government sources. Allen and Scott were old-school Washington insiders who had built their careers on cultivating relationships with officials willing to share information that couldn't be reported through normal channels. Their column appeared in newspapers across the country, providing readers with inside accounts of policy debates, personality conflicts, and political maneuvering that rarely appeared in straight news coverage. They were exactly the kind of journalists who thrived in the informal information networks that connected reporters and sources in the nation's capital. The surveillance operation that targeted them reflected concerns that had been building within the intelligence community about unauthorized disclosures of classified information. Allen and Scott's column sometimes contained details about foreign policy initiatives, intelligence operations, or diplomatic communications that suggested access to highly sensitive sources within the government. The wiretapping was authorized to identify those sources and assess the security implications of their relationship with the columnists. The irony was striking. The documented Project Mockingbird was actually an operation against journalists rather than an operation using journalists. Instead of representing CIA manipulation of the press, it demonstrated intelligence agency concerns about press independence and the difficulty of controlling information flow in a system where reporters maintained autonomous relationships with government sources. The technical aspects of the wiretapping operation were sophisticated by the standards of the early 1960s, involving coordination between FBI surveillance specialists and CIA counterintelligence officers who were trying to trace the flow of classified information from government agencies to media outlets. The operation required court authorizations, administrative approvals, and careful attention to legal boundaries that governed domestic surveillance activities. The conversations that were intercepted revealed the mundane reality of how Washington journalism actually worked: endless telephone calls between reporters and sources, negotiations over what could be published and what needed to remain confidential, discussions about the political implications of particular stories, complaints about editors who didn't understand the subtleties of foreign policy coverage. It was a world of professional relationships and personal friendships that operated according to informal codes of behavior rather than formal intelligence protocols. David P. Hadley's scholarly examination of the Davis theory represented the kind of careful historical analysis that was often missing from popular discussions of CIA media operations. Hadley, a researcher who had spent years studying declassified intelligence documents, found extensive evidence of CIA relationships with journalists and media organizations, but no documentary proof of a coordinated program called Operation Mockingbird. His work revealed the dangers of allowing compelling narratives to substitute for documentary evidence in historical analysis. The activities that Davis described were largely accurate. The CIA had indeed cultivated relationships with journalists, had funded media organizations through front groups, had used press credentials to provide cover for intelligence operatives, but these activities had developed organically over time through multiple programs and initiatives, rather than being coordinated through a single operation with a specific code name. The distinction was important for understanding both the scope and the limitations of CIA media activities during the Cold War. Rather than representing a master plan for controlling American journalism, the various programs reflected the ad hoc responses of intelligence officials to specific operational needs and strategic opportunities. This made the activities more difficult to identify and analyze, but it also meant they were less systematic and comprehensive than the Operation Mockingbird theory suggested. The power of the Davis theory lay not in its documentary accuracy but in its explanatory convenience. Operation Mockingbird provided a simple framework for understanding complex historical phenomena, a single name that could encompass decades of intelligence activities across multiple agencies and programs. The theory appealed to both conspiracy theorists who believed in deliberate government, manipulation of public opinion, and to serious researchers who were trying to understand the institutional relationships between intelligence agencies and news organizations. The resonance of the name itself contributed to the theory's persistence, even as scholars like Hadley challenged its factual foundations. Mockingbird felt right as a description of journalist-intelligence relationships, regardless of whether it had ever been used as an actual program designation. The metaphorical power of the name made it memorable and shareable in ways that more accurate but less evocative descriptions of CIA media activities could never achieve. The confusion between the two, Mockingbird's Davis's theorized operation and the documented surveillance project, illustrated broader problems in Cold War historiography, where the secrecy that surrounded intelligence activities created information vacuums that were filled by speculation, theory, and assumption. Researchers working with incomplete evidence had to choose between cautious conclusions based on limited documentation and more dramatic interpretations that seemed to explain broader patterns but couldn't be definitively proven. The intelligence agency's own classification policies contributed to this confusion by releasing some documents while withholding others, creating partial pictures that could support multiple interpretations. The material that was made available to researchers often raised more questions than it answered, suggesting the existence of activities and relationships that were more extensive than the documented evidence revealed, but leaving crucial details unclear or unconfirmed. The journalistic community's response to both Mockingbirds reflected the complex psychology of a profession that was simultaneously proud of its independence and aware of its vulnerabilities to government influence. Many journalists wanted to believe that their colleagues had maintained professional integrity even while acknowledging that intelligence agencies had made systematic efforts to cultivate media relationships. The Operation Mockingbird theory provided a framework for understanding these activities that preserved individual agency while acknowledging institutional compromise. The public's fascination with the Mockingbird story reflected broader concerns about media, credibility, and government transparency that had been building since the Watergate era. Americans who had learned to question official government statements were prepared to believe that intelligence agencies had been manipulating news coverage in sophisticated ways. The specific details mattered less than the general narrative of deception and manipulation that seemed consistent with other revelations about intelligence activities during the Cold War period. The academic community's treatment of the Mockingbird question demonstrated the challenges of writing contemporary history about classified activities where much of the relevant evidence remained unavailable to researchers. Historians had to balance scholarly caution against public interest, acknowledging the limitations of available evidence while trying to provide useful analysis of important historical questions. The declassification process that gradually revealed more information about CIA media activities created additional complications for researchers trying to distinguish between verified facts and persistent theories. Each new release of documents provided additional pieces of the puzzle, but also revealed how much information remained classified or had been destroyed. The result was an evolving understanding of intelligence-media relationships that constantly required revision as new evidence became available. The international dimensions of CIA media operations added another layer of complexity to the Mockingbird question. While Davis's theory focused primarily on domestic American journalism, the documented evidence revealed that many CIA media activities were directed at foreign audiences through American news organizations that had international reach. This meant that the same relationships and activities could serve both foreign propaganda purposes and domestic influence objectives, making it difficult to determine where legitimate foreign operations ended and inappropriate domestic manipulation began. The technological changes that occurred during the decades when these relationships developed also affected how they functioned and how they were perceived. The media landscape of the 1950s and 1960s, dominated by a few major newspapers and television networks, provided different opportunities and constraints for intelligence operations than would exist in later periods when media outlets proliferated and barriers to entry decreased. The legal and ethical frameworks that governed intelligence activities evolved during the same period, creating situations where relationships and activities that had been considered acceptable under earlier standards came to be seen as inappropriate or illegal under later interpretations. This evolution made it difficult to evaluate historical activities according to consistent standards and contributed to ongoing debates about their legitimacy and significance. The psychological impact of the Mockingbird story extended beyond its historical accuracy to influence how Americans understood the relationship between their government and their news media. Whether or not Operation Mockingbird had ever existed as Davis described it, the theory articulated concerns about media independence that resonated with audiences who had other reasons to question the credibility of both government and journalism. The persistence of the Mockingbird narrative, despite scholarly challenges to its factual basis, illustrated the power of compelling stories to shape historical understanding even when they couldn't be definitively proven. In a democratic society where public trust in institutions depends partly on understanding how those institutions function, theories that provide coherent explanations for complex phenomena will continue to influence opinion regardless of their documentary support. The legacy of both Mockingbirds, the surveillance, operation, and the media manipulation theory was a heightened awareness of the ways that information could be controlled and manipulated by powerful institutions, whether through wiretapping journalists or recruiting them through documented programs or theoretical operations. The intelligence agencies had demonstrated capabilities for influencing information flow that raised fundamental questions about democratic accountability and press independence. The two Mockingbirds ultimately represented different aspects of the same underlying tension between national security and democratic transparency. The documented surveillance program reflected legitimate concerns about protecting classified information, while the theorized manipulation program articulated equally legitimate concerns about preserving media independence. Both represented attempts to control information flow in ways that served government interests, and both raised questions about the appropriate boundaries of intelligence activities in a democratic society. The confusion between fact and theory that surrounded the Mockingbird story would become a recurring theme in Cold War historiography, where the secrecy that protected operational security also created opportunities for speculation and misunderstanding that could persist for decades, in a world where truth and fiction had been deliberately blurred by professional propagandists and disinformation specialists. Distinguishing between documented history and compelling theory would remain a challenge long after the specific circumstances that created the confusion had changed. The name Mockingbird would continue to evoke questions about media manipulation and government deception, regardless of its historical accuracy, serving as a symbol of broader concerns about institutional credibility and democratic accountability that transcended the specific activities it was originally meant to describe. Like the bird itself, the story had learned to mimic authentic historical narrative while serving purposes that went beyond simple, factual description, becoming part of the very phenomenon it purported to explain. The 1970s brought a different kind of reckoning to Washington. Watergate had cracked open the facade of government respectability, and suddenly Americans were ready to believe that their institutions might be capable of far more deception than they had ever imagined. The shuffle of classified documents in congressional hearing rooms became as familiar as the scratch of investigative reporters' pencils. Each page turned, revealing another layer of activities that had been conducted in the shadows while the American public trusted their government to operate within constitutional boundaries. I remember the way those revelations felt to Americans, who had grown up believing in their institutions, not the naive faith of children, but the mature confidence of citizens who understood that democracy required both transparency and accountability. The discovery that intelligence agencies had been conducting domestic surveillance, experimenting with mind control, and manipulating foreign governments created a crisis of trust that went beyond partisan politics to touch fundamental assumptions about the relationship between government and governed in a free society. The atmosphere in Washington during those years carried a peculiar quality, as if the city itself was holding its breath while waiting to discover what other secrets might emerge from the filing cabinets and safe houses where the Cold War had been fought. Every congressional hearing seemed to reveal activities that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Every leaked document suggested that the full scope of intelligence operations remained unknown even to the legislators who were supposed to provide oversight. Seymour Hersh's article in the New York Times on December 22, 1974, landed like a thunderbolt in this already charged atmosphere. His report on massive illegal domestic intelligence operations by the CIA provided the first comprehensive public account of activities that had been rumors and suspicions for years, but had never been documented by a journalist with Hersh's credibility and access to reliable sources. The story described surveillance operations against American citizens, infiltration of domestic political organizations, and violations of the CIA's charter that had been conducted systematically over more than 2 decades. Hersh had identified activities that affected thousands of Americans who had never suspected that their government was monitoring their activities, reading their mail, and maintaining files on their political associations and personal relationships. The impact of Hersh's reporting went beyond its specific revelations. To create political pressure for investigations that would have been impossible without the credibility that Watergate had given to claims about government wrongdoing. Americans who might have dismissed such allegations as conspiracy theories just a few years earlier were now prepared to believe that their intelligence agencies were capable of systematic violations of constitutional rights and legal boundaries. President Gerald Ford's response reflected the political calculations of an administration that was already struggling with the aftermath of Watergate and Nixon's resignation. Rather than dismissing Hersh's reporting or conducting a purely internal review, Ford announced the creation of the Rockefeller Commission, a blue-ribbon panel that would investigate CIA domestic activities and provide recommendations for preventing future violations. The commission was chaired by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller and included members with impeccable establishment credentials: former Treasury Secretary John Connor, former Commerce Secretary C. Douglas Dillon, former Solicitor General Erwin Griswold, and others whose reputations for integrity and discretion were supposed to reassure the public that the investigation would be thorough and honest, without being destructively sensational. But the Rockefeller Commission's mandate was limited to CIA domestic activities, and critics immediately pointed out that the panel included no one who could be considered genuinely independent of the intelligence community and the political establishment it served. The Commission's members were all part of the same elite circles that had produced the intelligence officials whose activities were being investigated, creating obvious questions about whether they would be willing to challenge fundamental assumptions about intelligence operations and government secrecy. The formation of the Church Committee in January 1975 represented a more serious congressional response to the questions that Hersh's reporting had raised. Senator Frank Church of Idaho was chosen to chair the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, a body that would conduct the most comprehensive investigation of American intelligence operations in the nation's history. Church brought to this assignment a combination of political skill and personal integrity that made him an effective chairman for such a sensitive investigation. He understood the legitimate needs of intelligence agencies while also recognizing the dangers that uncontrolled secret operations posed to democratic institutions. His background in foreign policy gave him credibility when discussing national security issues, while his reputation for independence assured critics that the investigation wouldn't be compromised by partisan considerations or establishment pressure. The committee's mandate was sweeping in scope, covering not just the CIA but the FBI, the National Security Agency, and military intelligence services. The investigation would examine domestic surveillance, foreign assassination plots, mail opening programs, and the full range of activities that had been conducted under the broad umbrella of national security operations during the Cold War period. The 16-month investigation that followed represented an unprecedented opening of intelligence. Agency files to congressional scrutiny, committee staff members reviewed hundreds of thousands of documents, interviewed current and former intelligence officers, and held public hearings that brought the details of secret operations into television. BROADCASTS, and newspaper headlines for the first time in American history. The hearings themselves had a surreal quality, as if the most sensitive secrets of the Cold War were being transformed into public entertainment through the medium of televised congressional proceedings. Americans watched senior intelligence officials describing assassination plots against foreign leaders, domestic surveillance operations against civil rights activists, and mind control experiments that seemed like science fiction but were documented in official government records. COINTELPRO emerged as one of the most disturbing programs revealed by the Church Committee investigation. The FBI's counterintelligence program had targeted domestic political organizations with techniques that included burglary, mail opening, wiretapping, and the deliberate disruption of legal political activities through disinformation and provocation operations. The scope of COINTELPRO operations was staggering: more than 2,000 separate actions against individuals and organizations that included civil rights groups, anti-war activists, student organizations, and even moderate political figures who had expressed views that FBI officials considered subversive or dangerous. The program had operated with virtually no oversight or legal constraints, creating a domestic intelligence capability that resembled the political police of authoritarian regimes more than law enforcement activities appropriate for a democratic society. MKUltra represented another dimension of intelligence activities that seemed to violate basic principles of human rights and medical ethics. The CIA's mind control research program had involved experiments on unwitting subjects, the use of hallucinogenic drugs in interrogation procedures, and collaboration with psychiatrists and psychologists who had violated their professional obligations to protect patient welfare and informed consent. The revelation that American intelligence agencies had been conducting human experiments without consent created particular outrage because it echoed the kinds of activities that Americans associated with Nazi Germany and communist dictatorships. The discovery that respected American universities and medical institutions had participated in these programs raised questions about the extent to which Cold War pressures had corrupted professional ethics and institutional integrity throughout American society. Thringwell, the CIA's mail opening program, provided evidence of systematic violations of Fourth Amendment rights that had affected hundreds of thousands of Americans over more than 2 decades. The program had intercepted and photographed personal correspondence between American citizens and foreign contacts, creating files on political activities, personal relationships, and business dealings that had nothing to do with legitimate intelligence, collection, or national security concerns. The technical capabilities revealed by these investigations demonstrated that intelligence agencies had developed surveillance technologies and operational methods that far exceeded what most Americans had imagined possible. The ability to intercept mail, monitor telephone conversations, conduct surreptitious entries, and maintain comprehensive files on millions of citizens created a government surveillance capability that approached the totalitarian ideal of complete information control over the population. The creation of permanent intelligence oversight mechanisms represented one of the most important long-term consequences of the Church Committee investigation. The establishment of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees created formal channels for congressional review of intelligence activities that had previously operated with minimal external supervision. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 established legal procedures for domestic surveillance, operations that required court approval and judicial oversight of activities that had previously been conducted solely on the authority of executive branch officials. Visser created institutional safeguards that were designed to prevent the kinds of abuses that the Church Committee had documented, while preserving necessary intelligence capabilities for legitimate national security purposes. But the committee's measured findings often disappointed Americans who had expected more dramatic revelations or more severe condemnations of intelligence activities. The investigation confirmed that serious abuses had occurred, but it also concluded that most intelligence officers had acted in good faith, according to the legal and policy guidance they had received from senior officials and political leaders. The committee's report acknowledged that intelligence agencies had developed capabilities and conducted operations that exceeded appropriate boundaries for democratic institutions, but it also recognized that these activities had been authorized by officials who believed they were necessary for protecting national security during an unprecedented global conflict with totalitarian opponents who used every available method to advance their objectives. The public reception of the Church Committee's work reflected the complex psychology of a nation that wanted to believe in the integrity of its institutions, while also acknowledging evidence of serious wrongdoing. Many Americans were satisfied that the investigation had exposed abuses and created safeguards against future violations, while others felt that the committee had been too cautious in its criticisms and too willing to accept national security justifications for activities that violated constitutional principles. The intelligence agency's response to the investigation was equally complex, combining cooperation with the formal review process with concerns that excessive disclosure might damage national security and operational effectiveness. Many intelligence officers believed that they had served their country faithfully under difficult circumstances, and they resented implications that their work had been inappropriate or illegal, when it had been conducted according to policies established by elected officials and senior administrators. The international implications of the Church Committee revelations were significant, as foreign governments and intelligence services learned details about American operations that had been closely guarded secrets for decades. The disclosure of assassination plots, covert operations, and intelligence relationships affected diplomatic relations and operational capabilities in ways that would influence American foreign policy for years to come. The media's coverage of the Church Committee investigation created its own complications, as journalists struggled to balance public interest in transparency against legitimate concerns about protecting intelligence sources and methods. The same news organizations that had demanded accountability for intelligence abuses also had to consider the potential consequences of publishing information that might compromise ongoing operations or endanger intelligence officers and their foreign contacts. The academic community's response to the Church Committee findings reflected broader debates about the appropriate role of intelligence agencies in a democratic society. Scholars in fields ranging from constitutional law to international relations had to reassess their understanding of how American institutions functioned and what constraints existed on government power during national security crises. The 16-month journey through the secret history of American intelligence operations left the nation with a more realistic but more troubling understanding of how power had been exercised during the Cold War. The shuffle of classified documents in those congressional hearing rooms had become the sound of democracy attempting to hold itself accountable, to understand what had been done in its name, and to establish safeguards that would prevent future violations of the principles that were supposed to distinguish American institutions from the authoritarian alternatives they had been created to oppose. Whether those safeguards would prove adequate would be tested in the decades to come as new threats and new technologies created new pressures for extraordinary measures that might once again blur the boundaries between necessary security and excessive power. Where service be with power was secure, it is so cower with arm up and will the bill with without it with will go what fu aga go but weapons Carl Bernstein's Rolling Stone article landed in October 1977, like a bomb in the already fractured landscape of American journalism. His claim that more than 400 journalists had secretly worked for the CIA created a sensation that the Church Committee's more measured findings never could. The thud of Rolling Stone magazines hitting newsstands across America carried with it the weight of accusations that would reshape how Americans understood the relationship between their government and their press, between the reporters they trusted and the agencies those reporters had served in ways the public had never suspected. I remember the way that article felt when it first appeared, not the careful, measured tone of congressional investigations or academic research, but the urgent, almost breathless quality of a reporter who believed he was exposing one of the most important stories of his generation. Bernstein understood the power of specific numbers, specific names, specific institutions, where the Church Committee had spoken in general terms about media relationships. Bernstein provided the kind of concrete details that transformed abstract policy debates into personal betrayals of public trust. The coffee shops and newsrooms where journalists gathered to discuss the story carried a peculiar atmosphere during those weeks after publication. Conversations that would normally have been conducted in normal tones were reduced to whispers, as if the very act of discussing which colleagues might have had CIA connections could somehow implicate the speakers in activities they had known nothing about. Paranoia was not entirely irrational if Bernstein's claims were accurate. Then any journalist working in foreign correspondence during the previous 2 decades might have unknowingly worked alongside intelligence operatives or been manipulated by sources with hidden agendas. The discrepancy between the Church Committee's official finding of 50 journalists involved in CIA operations and Bernstein's claim of more than 400 became a central point of controversy that revealed the limitations of both congressional investigations and journalistic. The Church Committee had worked with classified documents and sworn testimony, but their investigation had been constrained by legal boundaries and political considerations that limited their ability to identify individuals or pursue leads that might compromise ongoing operations. Bernstein, working as a private journalist with access to sources who were willing to speak off the record, could pursue allegations that congressional investigators couldn't substantiate through official channels. But his reporting also lacked the documentary evidence and formal verification procedures that had given credibility to the Church Committee's findings. The The result was a situation where the official investigation seemed incomplete, while the journalistic seemed sensational, leaving the public to choose between competing versions of the same historical events. The methodology that Bernstein used to arrive at his estimate of 400 journalists was never fully explained in his article, creating questions about whether he had documentary evidence to support such a specific claim, or whether the number represented an educated guess based on partial information. Sources who spoke to Bernstein on condition of anonymity described a CIA media program that was far more extensive than anything the Church Committee had documented, but the secretive nature of these sources made it impossible for readers to evaluate their credibility or verify their claims. The naming of specific individuals and institutions in Bernstein's article created a different kind of controversy than the general discussions of media relationships that had characterized previous investigations. When he identified particular journalists, editors, and news organizations as having cooperated with CIA operations, he was making accusations that could damage reputations and end careers, but which the named individuals often couldn't respond to without violating their own secrecy agreements or compromising sources and methods that remained classified. The New York Times found itself in the particularly awkward position of being described as the CIA's most valuable newspaper relationship, while simultaneously being expected to cover the story objectively for its readers. Times editors had to navigate between their professional obligation to report important news and their institutional interest in avoiding sensational coverage that might damage the newspaper's credibility and independence. The internal debates about how to handle Bernstein's allegations reflected broader tensions within the journalism profession about how to address revelations that challenged the industry's self-image and public reputation. The television networks faced similar challenges in covering a story that implicated their own industry, while also being newsworthy enough to demand extensive coverage. Producers and editors had to decide how much detail to include about specific allegations against news organizations, how to present competing versions of events when official sources contradicted journalistic sources, and how to maintain credibility while covering accusations that raised questions about media credibility more generally. The public's response to Bernstein's article reflected the broader erosion of institutional trust that had been building since Watergate and the Pentagon Papers. Americans who had already learned to question official government statements were prepared to believe that news organizations had been secretly cooperating with intelligence agencies in ways that compromised their independence and objectivity. The specific details mattered less than the general confirmation of suspicions about media manipulation that many people had harbored for years. The guessing game that developed among media consumers about which reporters and news organizations might have been CIA assets created a corrosive atmosphere of suspicion that affected the entire journalism profession. Readers began scrutinizing news coverage for signs of bias or manipulation that might indicate intelligence agency influence, while reporters found themselves having to defend their independence and credibility in ways that had never been necessary before. The international implications of Bernstein's revelations were significant. For American news organizations that maintained foreign bureaus and correspondents around the world, foreign governments that had previously cooperated with American journalists began to question whether those relationships had been used for intelligence collection purposes. Sources who had provided information to American reporters started to worry that their cooperation might have inadvertently assisted CIA operations in ways they had never intended. The academic community's response to Bernstein's article reflected the ongoing challenges of researching intelligence history with incomplete access to classified documents and sources. Scholars who were trying to understand the extent of CIA media operations found themselves caught between official denials, anonymous allegations, and documentary evidence that raised more questions than it answered. The sensational nature of Bernstein's claims made serious academic analysis more difficult, while also increasing public interest in research that might verify or refute his allegations. The intelligence community's reaction to the article was carefully calibrated to avoid confirming specific details while also not appearing to dismiss legitimate public concerns about accountability and oversight. CIA officials acknowledged that the agency had maintained relationships with journalists during the Cold War period, but they disputed both the scope of these relationships and their characterization as manipulation or control of news coverage. The legal implications of Bernstein's revelations created additional complications for both the journalists who had allegedly cooperated with the CIA and the intelligence officers who had allegedly recruited them. If such cooperation had involved violations of the agency's charter or journalists' professional ethics, there might be grounds for civil lawsuits or professional sanctions. But the secrecy that surrounded these relationships made it difficult to pursue legal remedies without compromising classified information or violating confidentiality agreements. The professional journalism organizations faced difficult decisions about how to respond to allegations that their members had secretly cooperated with intelligence agencies while maintaining their public roles as independent reporters. Professional codes of ethics generally prohibited journalists from accepting payments or assignments from government agencies. But these codes had been developed before the Cold War, created ambiguous situations where patriotic duty and professional independence might conflict. The psychological impact of Bernstein's article on working journalists was particularly acute for those who had covered foreign affairs during the periods when CIA media operations were allegedly most active. Even reporters who were confident of their own independence began to question whether sources they had trusted, stories they had written, or assignments they had accepted might have been influenced by intelligence operations they had known nothing about. The timing of Bernstein's article, coming at a moment when American confidence in institutions had already been shaken by Watergate, Vietnam, and the Church Committee revelations, amplified its impact on public opinion. The article appeared during a period when Americans were psychologically prepared to believe the worst about their government and their media, creating a receptive audience for allegations that might have been dismissed or minimized under different circumstances. The Rolling Stone magazine's decision to publish such a controversial article reflected the publication's positioning as an alternative voice in American journalism, one that was willing to challenge establishment institutions and conventional wisdom in ways that more traditional news outlets might avoid. The magazine's counterculture readership was particularly receptive to stories about government deception and media manipulation, creating an audience that was prepared to accept Bernstein's allegations without demanding the same level of documentary verification that might be expected by readers of more conventional publications. The competitive dynamics within the journalism profession influenced how other news organizations responded to Bernstein's scoop. Publications that had been scooped on such an important story about their own industry faced pressure to develop their own reporting that might verify, refute, or extend Bernstein's allegations. This competitive pressure created incentives for additional reporting that might not have been pursued. If the story had appeared in a more traditional news outlet with different audience expectations, the amplification effect created by media coverage of its own alleged compromise created a feedback loop that made the story larger and more influential than it might otherwise have been. Each news organization that covered Bernstein's allegations was simultaneously reporting on accusations against its own industry while also contributing to public awareness of those accusations. This self-referential quality gave the story unusual staying power and influence in public discourse. The political implications of Bernstein's revelations extended beyond their immediate impact on journalism to influence broader debates about intelligence, oversight, and accountability. Politicians who were already critical of intelligence agencies could point to the alleged media manipulation as evidence that existing oversight mechanisms were inadequate. Defenders of intelligence operations could argue that sensational journalism was undermining necessary national security capabilities through irresponsible disclosure of sensitive information. The cultural impact of the article reached beyond the immediate political and professional controversies. It generated to influence how Americans understood the relationship between information and power in their society. The idea that news coverage might be secretly influenced by intelligence agencies challenged fundamental assumptions about the independence of information sources that citizens relied on to understand their world and make political decisions. The legacy of Bernstein's Rolling Stone article would be measured not just in its immediate impact on public opinion or professional practices, but in its contribution to a broader cultural narrative about government deception and media manipulation that would influence American political discourse for decades. Whether his specific allegations were accurate in their details, the article articulated concerns about institutional credibility and democratic accountability that resonated with experiences many Americans had already had with other forms of official deception. The sound of those Rolling Stone magazines hitting newsstands in October 1977 marked a moment when the secret history of the Cold War collided with the public's right to know, when the careful distinctions drawn by congressional investigators gave way to the blunt accusations of investigative journalism. The reverberations from that collision would continue to shape American politics and journalism long after the specific details of CIA media operations had faded from headlines into footnotes of historical analysis. In the end, Bernstein's article represented both the power and the limitations of journalism as a tool for democratic accountability. It demonstrated the ability of skilled reporters to uncover important stories that official investigations might minimize or ignore. But it also showed how sensational allegations could take on lives of their own, regardless of their documentary accuracy or long-term consequences for the institutions they purported to expose. George H.W. Bush's 1976 prohibition on using journalists seemed like a clean break with the past. But Admiral Stansfield Turner's modification just 1 year later left a loophole large enough to drive a conspiracy theory through that small opening. Those very exceptional circumstances became the crack through which decades of public distrust would flow. The echo of empty promises in CIA briefing rooms carried the hollow ring of assurances that were carefully crafted to sound absolute while preserving precisely the flexibility that made them meaningless. I remember the way those policy announcements felt at the time, the crisp official language that seemed to address public concerns while actually changing very little about operational capabilities or institutional practices. Bush, in his brief tenure as CIA director, understood the political necessity of responding to congressional investigations and media revelations with policies that appeared to reform agency practices. His flat prohibition on hiring journalists seemed to draw a clear line that would prevent future controversies about media manipulation and intelligence operations. The language of Bush's directive was unambiguous in its public presentation. The Central Intelligence Agency would no longer enter into any paid or contract relationships with journalists or media organizations. The policy seemed to acknowledge that such relationships had been inappropriate and would be discontinued entirely. For Americans who had been troubled by revelations about CIA media operations, the prohibition appeared to represent a genuine commitment to respecting press, independence, and democratic accountability. But the bureaucratic reality of intelligence operations was more complex than public policy statements could easily address. Bush's prohibition covered formal employment relationships and contractual arrangements, but it didn't address the informal relationships, social connections, and voluntary cooperation that had characterized many of the most important CIA media relationships during the Cold War period. A journalist who shared information with intelligence officers at cocktail parties or provided insights during casual conversations wasn't technically violating the new policy, even if such interactions served the same purposes as more formal arrangements. Turner's 1977 modification, coming just 1 year after Bush's supposedly definitive prohibition, revealed the practical limitations of attempting to regulate intelligence activities through absolute policy statements. Turner, who had been appointed by President Jimmy Carter with a mandate to reform and modernize the CIA, understood that intelligence work required flexibility to respond to unusual circumstances and emerging threats that couldn't be anticipated when general policies were written. The very exceptional circumstances language that Turner added to the Bush prohibition was carefully crafted to preserve operational capability while maintaining the appearance of meaningful constraint. The modification allowed the CIA to recruit journalists or use journalistic cover in situations where national security interests were judged to be paramount. But it provided no clear definition of what circumstances would justify such exceptions or who would make such determinations. The practical effect of Turner's modification was to transform Bush's absolute prohibition into a general guideline that could be waived. Whenever intelligence officials believed it was necessary, this represented exactly the kind of bureaucratic maneuvering that had allowed intelligence abuses to develop and persist during the Cold War period. Policies that appeared to establish clear boundaries, but actually preserved the discretionary authority that made boundary violations possible. The public perception of these policy changes was shaped by the broader context of post-Watergate reforms and the Carter administration's promises to restore integrity and accountability to government operations. Many Americans interpreted Turner's modification as evidence that reform efforts were being undermined by institutional resistance from intelligence professionals, who were unwilling to accept meaningful constraints on their activities. The incomplete nature of these reforms reflected fundamental tensions between democratic accountability and intelligence effectiveness that had never been fully resolved. Intelligence operations often required secrecy, deception, and methods that would be inappropriate for other government agencies. But democratic societies needed oversight, mechanisms that could prevent abuses without compromising legitimate national security activities. The challenge was creating policies that could balance these competing needs without satisfying neither effectiveness nor accountability requirements. The lasting wound to public trust that resulted from revelations about CIA media operations would prove more significant than the specific activities that caused the controversy. Once Americans learned that their intelligence agencies had systematically deceived them about relationships with journalists and news organizations, it became difficult to accept official assurances about any intelligence activities or policies. The credibility that had been lost through decades of secret operations could not be restored through policy statements or bureaucratic reforms. The psychological impact of these revelations on American political culture was profound and enduring. The discovery that news coverage might have been secretly influenced by intelligence agencies challenged fundamental assumptions about information independence that were essential to democratic decision-making. If citizens couldn't trust their news sources to provide objective information, how could they make informed choices about political leaders and policy alternatives? The modern echoes of these Cold War controversies became apparent during subsequent decades, when new revelations raised similar questions about government credibility and media independence. The claims about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that helped justify the 2003 invasion seemed to many Americans like exactly the kind of intelligence manipulation that Church Committee investigations had exposed in earlier decades. The Amazon CIA contracts that became public knowledge in later years provided another example of how intelligence agencies continued to develop relationships with private companies that could raise questions about independence and accountability. When the Central Intelligence Agency signed cloud computing contracts with Amazon Web Services, critics wondered whether such arrangements might influence Amazon's other business activities, including its ownership of the Washington Post and other media properties.